Victor Crowley did not knock. He never knocked. He walked through the front door of the Voss property like he already owned it, because by sundown he would. He dropped the foreclosure papers on the kitchen table without looking at Eliza, the way a man drops a receipt he no longer needs. Her father had been buried 11 days. The soil over his grave was still soft. "You have until morning," Crowley said. He picked up a framed photograph from the mantel Eliza's parents on their wedding day, turned it over once, and set it face down. Not out of cruelty, out of indifference. That was somehow worse. Eliza was 29 years old. She had nursed her father through 2 winters of sickness, kept the cattle fed during a drought that broke 3 neighboring ranches, and had not cried once in front of anyone. She did not cry now, but her hands were shaking when she picked that photograph back up. That were you, if everything your family ever built was taken by a man who didn't even bother to look you in the eye, what would you do? This is the story of what Eliza Voss did. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now, because we tell stories here that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. Morning of the auction, Eliza woke before the sun. She had not slept, not really. She'd lain on her side in the narrow bed she'd slept in since childhood, staring at the wall where a water stain had been spreading slowly for 3 years. Her father had always meant to fix it. He never got around to it. There were 100 things he never got around to. Now there never would be a time for any of them. Me and the wall. The stain, the unpatched roof above the east corner of the barn, all of it was about to belong to someone else before noon. She got up, washed her face in cold water, put on her good dress, the dark blue one her mother had made, which was too tight across the shoulders now because she'd grown into a woman while her mother wasn't alive to notice. She brushed her hair back, pinned it, and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at nothing. Foreclosure notice was still on the table. She hadn't moved it. She didn't know why. Maybe because moving it would mean accepting it, and she wasn't there yet. Her father, Thomas Voss, had built this ranch from nothing. That was not a figure of speech. He had arrived in Cutter's Bend, Wyoming, with $43 and a mule that died the following spring. He'd dug the first fence post holes by hand. He'd slept in a tent through 2 winters before he could afford lumber for a proper structure. He'd done it alone. And then he'd done it with her mother. Then after her mother died of fever when Eliza was 7, he'd done it with just Eliza beside him, a quiet, determined little girl who learned early that the land didn't care about your grief, kept demanding work whether you were heartbroken or not. She had respected that about the land. She had loved it the way you love something that is honest with you, even when the honesty is hard. And now Victor Crowley was going to take it. She picked up her father's journal from the table, a worn leather thing, the pages soft from years of handling, and she put it in the canvas bag with her 2 changes of clothes, a tin of coins she'd saved from the last 3 months of selling eggs in town, and her mother's silver brooch. She did not take anything else. She had told herself she would not take anything else, because if she started, she would stand in this house all morning with her arms full of objects, and she would never leave. She walked out without looking back. The auction was held in the town square of Cutter's Bend, which was a generous name for what was really just a wide patch of packed dirt in front of the general store. There were maybe 30 people gathered, not all of them there, for the auction. Some were just watching. That was the thing about towns like this: suffering had an audience whether you invited one or not. Eliza stood at the back of the crowd. She had thought about not coming at all, but something in her needed to witness it. She didn't know if that was strength or punishment. The auctioneer, a thin man named Durley, who wore a hat that was too large for his head, read out the particulars in a flat, bored voice. Lot 7, the Voss property, 212 acres, including cattle rights and water access to the South Fork of Redstone Creek. Starting bid. Victor Crowley stood to the left of the auctioneer's platform. He was not a physically impressive man, average height, soft in the middle, with a neatly trimmed beard that he clearly spent money on. His clothes were expensive in a way that was meant to be noticed. He had the face of a man who had never once in his life been told no and meant it, which gave him a particular kind of confidence that looked from a distance like dignity, but wasn't. Bid twice. There was no real competition. There never was when Crowley was involved. Other men in Cutter's Bend understood how things worked. Didn't bid against Crowley. You didn't make a face when he won. Clapped, or you stayed quiet, and either way the result was the same. Eliza watched her father's land go for less than it was worth. She had known it would. She watched Crowley sign the transfer document with a fountain pen he produced from his breast pocket, and she watched him hand the pen back to Durley without making eye contact. She watched him turn and say something to the man beside him, his lawyer, she thought, and they both smiled. Smile. She turned and walked away before she did something she couldn't take back. She didn't know yet where she was going. That was a truth she had to sit with, which was harder than it sounds when you have spent your entire life in one place, and that place no longer exists in the way you understood it. Nah, she walked the road north out of town because it was the direction she happened to be facing. And she kept walking. Then the morning got hotter, and her bag got heavier, and she did not stop. She had been walking for perhaps an hour when she sat down on a flat rock at the side of the road and opened her father's journal to no particular page. She found one of his lists. He loved lists. Things to repair, things to plant, things to ask the feed store about, things he was grateful for. This one was from 4 years ago. It said, in his careful, blocky handwriting. Eliza fixed the north fence without being asked. She is better at this than she knows. She closed the journal. She sat there a while longer. Then she stood up, put the journal back in the bag, and kept walking. She heard about Blackridge Ranch from a woman named May Pruitt, who ran a roadside food stand about 8 miles north of Cutter's Bend, and who would talk to anyone who stopped, whether they were buying or not. Eliza stopped because her feet hurt, and she was thirsty, and she had 3 coins left. After paying for a night in the cheapest boarding room she could find the previous week, which meant she could afford water but not much else. May was a broad woman in her 50s with sun-cracked hands and the kind of directness that comes from decades of talking to strangers who are passing through. She took one look at Eliza, the good dress that was now travel-wrinkled, the bag, a particular set of her jaw, and said, "You looking for work, just looking lost." "Work," Eliza said. "I'll do anything reasonable." May handed her a cup of water and thought about it. "Cook? I can cook. You willing to go somewhere most people aren't willing to go?" Eliza looked at her. "Where Blackridge Ranch?" "Wyatt Callahan's place, about 6 miles east of here." May paused, wiping down the counter in long, practiced strokes. "He's gone through 4 cooks since spring. The last one left in the middle of the night and didn't even take her hat. Man's not easy to work for. Ranch is a mess. Hands are rough. The pay is decent," but she stopped. "But what?" May looked at her steadily. "He's not a mean man. I want to be clear about that. He's just somewhere else. Lost his wife 3 years ago. Lost a son before that. Ranch is falling apart, and he doesn't seem to notice, or if he notices, he doesn't care enough to stop it." She folded the cloth she'd been using. "The last woman who left said the place felt haunted." I don't know if she meant that literally. Eliza thought about the flat rock where she'd sat reading her father's journal. She thought about the direction she happened to be facing when she walked out of the auction. 6 miles east, she said. "Follow the ridgeline. There's a gate with a broken latch. You'll know it." She knew it. The gate hung crooked on its post, the latch bent out of shape, and the sign above it had once read Blackridge in painted letters, but now read Blackridge because 3 letters had come off and nobody had replaced them. Fence line on either side was functional but patched badly, the kind of patching that said we fixed this because we had to, not because we wanted to. Nah. There was a split rail section near the gate that had simply given up and collapsed, and someone had piled the rails to the side like they'd meant to deal with them later. The road up to the main house was rutted. The barn needed paint. There was a chicken coop with a hole in the wire that hadn't been repaired, which was the kind of small detail that told you about the larger situation, because if a man can't be bothered with a 6-inch hole in chicken wire, property is probably in corresponding states of neglect. The house itself was not falling down. It was a substantial structure, built well, built to last. But it had the look of a place where someone had simply stopped caring. The window shutter hung at an angle. The porch boards were clean, but the railing had a section missing. The flower bed under the front window, and there had clearly been a flower bed once. You could see the outline of it was overgrown with weeds. Eliza stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and took this all in. She was not discouraged by it. She was, in a way she couldn't entirely explain, relieved. Perfect Ranch wouldn't need her. This one did. She knocked. The man who answered the door looked like he had been interrupted from doing absolutely nothing, which she would come to understand was not far from the truth. Wyatt Callahan was probably 40, maybe a hard 45. It was difficult to tell, because he had the kind of face that suggested he'd spent a lot of time outdoors and not enough time sleeping. He was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting, and he was wearing a shirt that had seen better weeks. He held the door open with one hand and looked at her with an expression that was not hostile, exactly, but was not welcoming either. It was simply measuring. "You're not from the agency," he said. "No. I heard in town you needed a cook." He looked past her briefly at the rutted road she'd come up, then back at her. "Who told you that?" "May Pruitt." Something shifted in his face at that name, not warmth exactly, but recognition of something trustworthy. He opened the door a little further. "What's your experience?" he asked. "I ran a working household for 8 years. I cooked for a crew of 6 during calving season, kept accounts, managed supplies. I can do what needs doing." He was quiet for a moment. "The last woman didn't last 3 weeks, I know." "One before her, I know," Eliza said. "May told me." Another silence. Behind him, she could hear voices from somewhere deeper in the house, male voices, the kind of overlapping noise that means a group of men with nothing organized to do. "Pay is $3 a week," Wyatt said, room and board included. "Eat what the crew eats. Sleep in the small room off the kitchen. Cook 3 meals a day, plus whatever's needed during long work stretches. Stay out of ranch business." He paused. "Do those terms work?" "They do," she said. He stepped back from the door. Not exactly an invitation, more like a removal of an obstacle. She walked in. The kitchen was worse than she had expected, which was saying something. It was not dirty. Precisely, someone had swept recently, but it was the kitchen of a place that had lost its organizing intelligence. Shelves were in the wrong order. The good cast iron was stacked under lighter pans that should have been on top. A sack of flour, with a small tear in the corner that nobody had bothered to transfer to a sealed container, which meant it had been slowly absorbing moisture and probably had weevils by now. Stove needed blacking. The water barrel was only a quarter full. Eliza set her bag down and stood in the middle of the room and looked at it the way her father used to look at a problem, not upset by it, just studying it, finding the shape of what needed to be done. A man came in from the other room. He was shorter than Wyatt, with a face like a closed fist and a foreman's bearing, the kind of man who walked into every room like he'd already decided he was in charge of it. Stopped when he saw Eliza, and his expression was not exactly surprised, but was something adjacent to it. "You the new cook?" he said. It did not sound like a question that particularly wanted an answer. "Yes," she said. He looked at the bag on the floor, then at her. "You know anything about cooking for 12 men? More than you know about asking polite questions." There was a beat of absolute silence. Then the foreman, she would learn his name, was Gideon Shaw, made a short, humorless sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, or might have been something else entirely, and he walked back out. Eliza opened the flour sack and confirmed her suspicion about the weevils. She got to work. The first meal she cooked at Blackridge Ranch was supper that same evening. She had approximately 4 hours, a half-depleted pantry, and a stove that ran hot on the left side and barely at all on the right. She made biscuits, which required learning the temperamental stove faster than she would have liked. The first batch came out lopsided, darker on one side, and she ate those herself standing at the counter rather than throw them away. Second batch was better. She made a beef stew from a cut of meat that was technically serviceable if you were not too sentimental about it, coaxed into something decent by the addition of dried herbs she found at the back of the second shelf and a patience with the simmer that most people didn't bother with. She made a pot of coffee strong enough to be useful. She set the table, she put the food out. The men came in and sat down. There were 11 of them, plus Wyatt at the head of the table and Gideon Shaw at the other end. They ranged from a boy who looked about 16 and was trying to grow a beard to a weathered man in his 60s who moved carefully and whose hands shook slightly, not from age, but from some old injury that had healed wrong. They were all road-worn, sun-browned, and hungry, and they all gave Eliza varying degrees of the same look, the look of men who had been disappointed before and were preparing to be disappointed again. She did not try to win them over. She just put the food in front of them. The silence that happened when men are actually eating, genuinely eating, not just going through the motions, is different from other kinds of silence. It has a texture to it. Eliza had grown up in that silence, and she recognized it now, in the way conversation fell away, and the only sounds were spoons against bowls and the scrape of a biscuit being pulled from the basket. Gideon Shaw ate 2 servings. He did not comment on this. Boy with the beard, his name was Caleb. She'd learned, looked up from his bowl about halfway through and said, "Is there more coffee?" "On the stove," she said. He got up and got it. He poured a cup for the man beside him without being asked. That was how she first understood that Caleb, for all his youth and the slightly chaotic energy he carried, was the kind of person who thought about other people without being prompted to. Wyatt ate, but not much. He was there in body but elsewhere in the way that May Pruitt had tried to describe and hadn't quite managed to. He answered a direct question from Gideon about a fence repair, but did not volunteer anything, and when the meal was done, he stood up without ceremony and left the room. The other men drifted out. Caleb helped carry bowls to the wash basin without being asked, which surprised her. He said night. The old man with the damaged hand said quietly as he passed, "Good stew." That was it. That was everything. Eliza washed the dishes alone, which was fine. Preferred it. You could think while you washed dishes. She thought about what needed fixing and in what order. The flour first, then the water situation. Then she needed to understand the pantry properly and make a list of what had to be sourced from town before the end of the week. She thought about the way Gideon Shaw had looked at her and said, "You know anything about cooking for 12 men?" And she thought about the particular satisfaction of the answer she had given him. She thought about her father's journal. She dried her hands, banked the fire in the stove, and went to the small room off the kitchen that was now hers. The bed was narrow, and the pillow was thin, and the window had a crack in the corner of the glass that someone had sealed with pitch. Was, she thought, a beginning. She had been at Blackridge for 6 days, when she understood that the ranch's problems were deeper than a disorganized kitchen and a leaderless crew. The signs had been there from the first morning. She had woken early to start breakfast and found 2 of the ranch hands, Decker, and a heavy-set man called Rourke, in a disagreement that had moved past words and was heading toward something physical, stopped only by Gideon Shaw's arrival with a voice like a slamming door. She had watched from the kitchen doorway and seen the thing underneath the conflict. Not meanness, exactly, but aimlessness. Men who were good at their work, but hadn't been given any clear direction in a long time, filling that vacancy with friction. Gideon ran the ranch in the way a man runs something he's been left in charge of, but doesn't quite have authority over, constantly compensating, never quite settling. He was competent, and he was proud of that competence, and those 2 things together made him territorial in ways that didn't always serve the ranch. Wyatt Callahan, she was beginning to understand, had simply withdrawn. She first saw evidence of this on the 3rd morning. When she brought a question about the supply situation to him, she needed to know what credit they had at the general store in Cutter's Bend before she could plan the next week's meals, and found him standing at the window of his study looking out. Pasture, with the expression of a man who is seeing something that isn't there. She knocked on the open door. He turned. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. "I need to know about the account at Doyle's." He looked at her for a moment as if reorienting himself. "Gideon handles that," I asked Gideon. "He said to ask you." Pause. Something moved across his face, not quite irritation, more like a man who has been outmaneuvered by a minor logistical detail. "Credit, use what you need." "I'll need a figure," she said. "So I know what I'm working with." He told her the figure. It was adequate but not generous. She thanked him and left. She thought about the way he had been standing at that window, and what May Pruitt had said about a man who was somewhere else. She thought about what it would take to be that far gone from your own life, and she understood it more than she would have admitted to anyone, because she had been in something like that place herself, that strange, suspended day after her father's death, before the foreclosure papers arrived, and grief was replaced by the more immediate problem of survival. Grief was still there, of course. She just hadn't had time to feel it properly yet. On the 5th day, she reorganized the pantry completely. She transferred the damaged flour, what was salvageable, to a sealed tin, and ordered new sacks from Doyle's. She inventoried everything, labeled the shelves, and created a simple system for tracking what was used and when it needed replacing. This was not glamorous work. She did it anyway. On the 6th day, she found the account ledger that someone had shoved under the pantry shelf and apparently forgotten about. She almost put it back. It wasn't her business. The corner was sticking out, and something made her pull it free and open it. She spent 20 minutes in the pantry, with the door half closed, reading. When she was done, she had a much clearer picture of why Blackridge Ranch looked the way it looked. Accounts were not catastrophically bad, but they were bad in the slow, grinding way that is almost worse, month after month of small losses that nobody had addressed. Supply costs that were too high, because no one was negotiating. Repair expenses that kept recurring, because nobody was doing proper preventive maintenance. Ranch was bleeding out through a dozen small wounds. She put the ledger back where she found it. She stood in the pantry for a moment. Then she went and started dinner. Injury happened on the 8th day. She heard it before she saw it, a shout from the yard, the particular kind of shout that is not an argument but an alarm, and she was out the back door before she had decided to move. A young ranch hand named Pete Ortega was on the ground near the south fence line. He'd been repairing a section of broken wire, barbed wire, the kind that doesn't care whose hand is in the way, and the tensioner had slipped and the wire had snapped back across his forearm. He was sitting up, which was good, but his arm was bleeding badly, and the men standing around him were doing what men often do in a medical situation, standing there, looking like they wanted someone else to be in charge. Pushed through to him. She knelt down and looked at the wound, which was a long, ugly gash across the outside of his forearm, deep in places, but not, she thought, deep enough to have hit anything critical. It needed to be cleaned and bound, and he needed to be kept still, and she needed something to work with. "Get me the kit from the kitchen," she said to no one in particular. "Top shelf left side, white tin box." Someone went. Pete was looking at his arm with the calm expression of a person who has not yet fully processed what has happened to them. "Bad?" he asked. "We'll keep the arm," she said, which was what she actually believed, and which she said simply and without dramatic emphasis, because unnecessary fear didn't help anyone. "Good," he almost smiled at that. "Good. I'm left-handed." She pressed her folded apron against the wound and held it there. Caleb arrived with the kit. He was the one who'd gone for it, which didn't surprise her. She had him hold the cloth in place while she opened the tin and found the carbolic, the bandaging cloth, and the small pair of scissors. Wound was worse than she'd initially assessed, in the sense that it was dirtier wire, Carrie's things, and she cleaned it thoroughly and without rushing, which meant Pete made several sounds she had a certain sympathy for. She bound it tightly, elevated his arm, and told him to stay where he was for 10 minutes before trying to stand. Gideon Shaw had arrived sometime during this and was watching from a few feet back. When Eliza stood up, she found him looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not respect, exactly. More like the beginnings of a reassessment. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. "My father," she said. "When you're far from a doctor, you learn." He nodded slowly. Looked at Pete, who was still sitting on the ground, arm elevated, looking somewhat more philosophical about the situation than he had 5 minutes ago. "Can he work tomorrow?" "In 2 or 3 days," she said. "Push him before that. The wound will reopen and you'll lose more than 3 days." Gideon looked like he wanted to argue with this, but he was looking at the wound, which made the argument difficult. He nodded again and walked away. Caleb helped Pete to his feet when the 10 minutes were up, made it as far as the water trough before he sat down again and went pale in the specific way of someone whose body is catching up to what just happened. "Give it a minute," Eliza said, sitting beside him. "That's normal." "Doesn't feel normal," Pete said. "Most things that are normal don't feel like it at the time." Sat there a moment. "You've been here a week, and you already know more about this place than the last 3 cooks put together." She looked at him. He was young 20, maybe with a direct way of saying things that wasn't rudeness, just honesty. "I pay attention," she said. "Gideon's going to be watching you now," Pete said. "You should know that. He watches everyone who's good at anything, because he figures they're competition." "I'm a cook," she said. "I'm not competing with anyone." Pete gave her a look that suggested he found this assessment incomplete. "You're more than a cook," he said. "Anybody with eyes can see that." She didn't answer him. She was thinking about the ledger under the pantry shelf, and the broken gate latch, and the way Wyatt Callahan stood at his study window looking at something that wasn't there. She was thinking about what it would take to actually fix this place. Not just cook meals and keep the stove clean, but genuinely fix it. She hadn't decided yet if that was her business, but she was beginning to think that it might become so, whether she decided or not. First time Wyatt Callahan actually talked to her, not a transaction about supplies or a terse answer to a logistics question, but an actual conversation, was on the 9th night, after everyone else had gone to bed. She had stayed up to put a batch of bread on to rise for morning and was cleaning the counter when she heard him come into the kitchen. He moved quietly for a large man. She was not startled. She had heard the floorboard in the hallway and tracked his approach, but she didn't turn around immediately. Poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she kept warm on the low side of the stove and sat down at the kitchen table. She kept working. After a moment, he said, "Pete's arm looks better than I expected." "Will heal clean," she said, "as long as he doesn't use it too soon." Said you didn't hesitate. She turned then, just enough to look at him. Hesitating doesn't help the person who's hurt. Wyatt looked at his coffee. Had the hands of a man who had done real work, scarred knuckles. a thick callus on the right palm from the inside of a rain. Turned the cup once, slowly. Where are you from? She paused. Cutter's Bend. South of here, I know Cutter's Bend. He looked up. Said you ran a household for 8 years. What happened to it? She had been expecting the question. She had thought about how to answer it. She decided on the truth because it was simpler to manage than a version of the truth. Father died. The ranch went at auction. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Foreclosure? Yes. Who held the note? She set down the cloth she'd been using. Turned to face him properly. Victor Crowley. Something happened to his expression. Not surprise, more like a door closing. I know Crowley, he said. Most people around here do. Wyatt stopped. Started again. He doesn't do things by accident. No, Eliza said, he doesn't. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove made its small, steady sounds. I'm sorry about your father, Wyatt said. Was said simply, without performance, and it landed differently than she expected, because she had been keeping the grief at a careful distance for weeks now, and something about the simplicity of those words made it suddenly, briefly real. She nodded once. Thank you. He finished his coffee. Stood up and rinsed the cup at the basin, which surprised her, because it was the kind of small domestic consideration she hadn't expected from him, and he said, Bread will be good, looking at the covered dough on the counter. By morning, she said. He went back to bed. Eliza stood in the kitchen for a moment, alone. She put her hand flat on the counter and felt the faint warmth of the stove through the wood. She thought about Victor Crowley, and the way Wyatt had said, I know Crowley not with fear, but with the careful tone of a man who knows where a particular danger lives and keeps his distance from it. She thought about the foreclosure papers on the kitchen table, and the face-down photograph and the auction where her father's land had gone for less than it was worth. She thought about the ledger under the pantry shelf, and the broken gate and the fence, and all the small wounds this ranch was bleeding from. She went to her room. She opened her father's journal. She read 3 pages she had already read a dozen times, about things to repair and things to plant, and one line near the bottom of a page that said, in her father's handwriting, broken thing is not the same as a ruined thing. She closed it. She turned out the lamp. Outside, somewhere in the dark distance, a coyote called once and was answered by nothing. Eliza lay in the narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen of Blackridge Ranch. And she was not comfortable. She was not safe. She was not home, but she was here. She was working. And tomorrow there would be bread. And that, for now, was enough. Bread was good. She had known it would be, but there was still a particular satisfaction in watching Caleb tear into a piece of it at breakfast, like he hadn't eaten in a week, and watching even Gideon Shaw cut himself a second slice without acknowledging that he had done so. Small victories were real victories. She had learned that from her father, who celebrated a good fence post the same way other men celebrated a good harvest. 10th morning at Blackridge began the way most mornings had before light. The stove, the water, methodical preparation of a meal for 13 people who would arrive hungry and leave in a hurry. She had learned their patterns by now. Decker wanted his coffee before he sat down. Rourke ate slowly and kneaded the pot nearby. Old Harris, the man with the damaged hands, took his biscuit soft if she could manage it, because his jaw had been broken years ago and healed imperfectly, though he would never have asked her to accommodate that, and likely didn't know she'd noticed. She noticed. It cost her nothing to notice. What she had not anticipated about Blackridge in those first days was how much the house itself would get inside her. Not in a sentimental way, she was not given to sentimentality, or she hadn't been before her father died, and she was still deciding who she was now that the life she'd built herself around was gone. It was more that the ranch had a presence, a weight, the way a place does when it has held a lot of living. Feel the shape of what it had been before Wyatt withdrew, before whatever losses had taken him out of his own life and left the running of things to Gideon's compensating authority and the ranch's own slow momentum toward disorder. There had been a woman here who planted flowers. That much was obvious from the ghost of the bed under the front window. Someone had cared about that, had gone out in the morning and tended something that didn't produce food or income but made the place feel like a home. That woman was gone now, and the weeds had come in. Scott and Wyatt walked past those weeds every day and did not see them, or saw them and felt something he couldn't afford to feel, and looked away. Eliza understood that. She did not feel sorry for him. Because of it, he was a grown man, and the ranch was his responsibility, but she understood it. Felt was something more complicated. Recognition. An unwanted kinship with a man who had also lost everything that organized his world, and had responded by going somewhere internal and staying there. She just hadn't had the luxury of staying. On the 11th day, Gideon Shaw came into the kitchen at mid-morning, which he had never done before. He always came at mealtimes or sent someone else with questions. His appearing during the in-between hours meant something. She was inventorying the dry goods. She kept her back to him and finished the count she was on before she turned around, because she had established early that she would not drop what she was doing simply because Gideon Shaw entered a room. He stood with his arms crossed, which was his default posture. It was the posture of a man who was always slightly braced for argument. "I want to talk about Ortega," he said. "His arm is healing," she said. "Another 2 days and he can do light work. I'll tell you when." "That's not—" He stopped, adjusted. "That's not what I'm here about." He uncrossed his arms and then crossed them again, which she found interesting, a man who didn't know what to do with his hands while he was being something other than combative. "I wanted to say that you handled it right. With Pete. What you did." She looked at him. "Thank you. I'm not another stop. I'm not always easy to work with. I know that." "I hadn't noticed," she said, which was a lie so obvious it could only be taken as a joke. Something moved across Gideon's face that was almost a smile. "Right," he said. He looked at the shelf she'd been working on. "Reorganized the whole pantry. It needed it." The last cook said the pantry was fine. "The last cook left in the night without her hat," Eliza said. "So I'm not sure her assessment of the pantry is the most reliable standard." This time he did almost smile, got closer to it than before. He was looking at the labeled shelves, the logical ordering of things, the tin she'd put the flour in. "It's better," he said, with the particular brevity of a man for whom saying it's better costs something. She said. "It is," he left. She turned back to the dry goods. She had not softened toward Gideon Shaw exactly, but she had revised her initial assessment. He was not hostile to her because she was a woman or because she was an outsider, though those things were probably in there somewhere. He was hostile because the ranch's disorder threatened something in him, some need for things to be controlled, and he couldn't control the ranch's actual problems, so he controlled whatever came into his territory. Now, she was in his territory, and she was also controlling things, which should have made the situation worse. Instead, it seemed to have relieved some pressure, like another person finally picking up some of the weight. She added this to what she was learning about Blackridge Ranch. Picture was getting clearer every day, and it was not entirely a comfortable picture. Ledger under the pantry shelf had been bothering her for days. She was not an accountant. She was not a ranch manager. She had no claim to any part of Blackridge's business, and she was aware that she was here as a cook, and that the boundaries of her role were both obvious and, for her continued employment, important to respect. Gideon Shaw was already watchful. White Callahan was already elsewhere. The last thing she needed was to be seen as overstepping. And yet she understood numbers. She had managed her father's account since she was 19, had negotiated with the feed store and the equipment supplier, and had once caught an error in a contract that would have cost them 2 months' income if she hadn't noticed. The ledger she'd found was not mysterious. It was simply a record of what was coming in and what was going out, and what was going out was consistently more than it should have been in 2 specific categories. First was feed. The price per unit they were paying at Doyle's was higher than it should have been for a ranch, Blackridge's size significantly higher. Kind of higher that suggested either nobody had negotiated in years, or something else was happening. Second was the water rights fee. There was a quarterly payment recorded, a substantial one, to something called the Redstone Land and Water Company. She had never heard of it. The payment had been there for at least 3 years of recorded entries. It was listed simply as Water Access Fee South Fork, and the amount was consistent and large enough that it was, month over month, one of the most significant drains on the ranch's operating finances. She thought about what Wyatt had said the night she arrived. "There's a water access fee South Fork." She thought about the South Fork of Redstone Creek, which she had passed on her walk up from May Pruitt's stand and which ran, clear and cold, through the eastern corner of the Blackridge property. She thought about whether a creek that ran through your own property should require a quarterly payment to a company she had never heard of. She put the ledger back. She went and made lunch, but she thought about it. It was Caleb who told her about the Redstone Land and Water Company, without knowing that she had asked. Didn't know he'd answered a question. Was talking about his day, the way he sometimes did when he helped her carry supplies in, from the wagon he had taken to doing this on delivery days. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he was the kind of person who filled available space with helpfulness. He was telling her about a fence repair near the creek, and he said, almost in passing, ran into one of Crowley's men out near the South Fork boundary. Third time this month. She kept her hands busy with the crate she was unpacking. Crowley has men near the South Fork? He's got men everywhere, Caleb said with the easy dismissiveness of someone used to a fact that had stopped surprising him. Owns the water company. Or mostly owns it, I don't really know how that works. Gideon says he's had his hand in the Redstone water rights since before I came on. She set down a tin of salt. Crowley owns the Redstone Land and Water Company. Most of it, I think. Something like that. Caleb set the last box on the counter and brushed dust off his hands. Why? Just curious, she said. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, not suspicious, just attentive. It was perceptive in the straightforward way of someone who hadn't yet learned to distrust their own observations. Don't ask questions just to ask them, he said. No, she agreed. I usually don't. He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't, so he went back out to return the wagon. Stood in the kitchen with the unpacked crate in front of her and a very clear, very cold understanding settling in her chest. Victor Crowley owned the company that was collecting water rights fees from Blackridge Ranch. Victor Crowley, who had also held the note on her father's property. Victor Crowley, whose men were seen regularly near the South Fork boundary, a boundary that ran along the edge of water access that Blackridge was paying. Every quarter. For the right to use was not proof of anything. She knew that. A man could own a water company and collect fees and have employees who monitored his assets, and none of that was illegal on its own. But it was a shape, and shapes in her experience had meanings. She said nothing to Wyatt that night, or the night after. She needed to think first, and thinking required that she understand more than she currently did. Guy, she asked May Pruitt, on the day she went to town for supplies, about the Redstone Land and Water Company casual. In the way she'd asked about Blackridge when she'd been looking for work, just curiosity from a newcomer learning how the area worked. May knew things the way women who ran roadside stands always knew things because they talked to everyone who passed, and everyone who passed eventually said something useful. Crowley set it up maybe 4 years back, May said, right after the county surveyor reclassified the creek boundaries. There was a whole dispute about it, who owned what section of water access, and somehow Crowley ended up with the controlling interest in the company that managed the rights. She handed Eliza the package of sugar she'd asked about, which May kept behind the counter for reasons that had never been explained. Ranchers who use that creek Blackridge, the Heller outfit east of here, the Donahue place, they all pay into it quarterly. Some of them been grumbling about it for years. Has anyone challenged it? May gave her a long look. The kind of challenging you'd need costs money most of them don't have. Crowley's got a lawyer in every town from here to the territorial capital. She paused. Why are you asking? I'm trying to understand how this part of the country works, Eliza said, which was true, in its way. May was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the particular way of someone who knows they're not getting the whole story, but has decided to respect that. Be careful, she said finally. Crowley notices when people start asking questions. I've noticed him before, Eliza said. He doesn't scare me. That, said May, might be the most dangerous thing you've said to me yet. She told Wyatt on the 14th night. She had been building up to it, choosing the moment carefully, because she knew it would change something between them and she wanted to be sure before it changed. She chose the kitchen, late, after the house was quiet, because that was the only place she'd seen him be close to present in himself. She waited until he came in for his late coffee, which he had started to do most nights, in which she had started to not go to bed before, though she hadn't examined that fact too closely. He sat down. She poured the coffee without being asked. She'd started doing that, and she sat down across from him, which she hadn't done before. She had always remained standing. Sitting was a different thing. He noticed. The ledger under the pantry shelf, she said. Counts one. I read it. He looked at her. His expression was carefully still. That's not, I know, she said. It's not my business. I know that. But I'm going to tell you what I found, and then you can decide what to do with it. And after that, I'll go back to being the cook. He was quiet. He turned the coffee cup once. Go ahead. She told him about the feed prices, the margin, what she thought it should be, versus what the ledger showed. Listened without interrupting. Then she told him about the water rights fee, and about the Redstone Land and Water Company, and about what May Pruitt had told her about the county surveyor and the reclassification and how Crowley had ended up with controlling interest. Then she told him about Crowley's men near the South Fork boundary, which Caleb had mentioned and which she had not told Caleb she was thinking about. Wyatt's expression had not changed through most of this. But at the mention of men near the South Fork, something shifted, a very small thing, a tightening around the eyes that wasn't quite anger, but was in that neighborhood. How often, he said. Caleb said 3 times this month. He mentioned it like it was normal. It is normal, Wyatt said, but he said it like a man who has said something for so long he has stopped hearing it. Is it? Eliza said. He looked at her. Man who owns the water rights company that you pay into every quarter, she said. Carefully, also sending men to monitor the boundary where that water access sits. That might be routine business. It might also be something else. She paused. I don't know what Crowley's next move is, but I know he doesn't do things without a reason, and his reasons are usually about consolidation. Wyatt was very still. How do you know what Crowley does and doesn't do? Because he took my father's land, she said, and before he took it, he spent a year making it harder and harder to hold on to. Small things. Supply prices going up. A water access dispute not unlike this one. Debt that seemed manageable until it wasn't. She met his eyes. Patient. He's very patient, and he picks ranches that are already struggling. Kitchen was quiet for a long time after that. Wyatt looked at his coffee, looked at the window, which showed only dark. He had the expression of a man working through something he would rather not be working through, not denial exactly, but the discomfort of a thing that has been at the edge of your awareness for a long time being placed squarely in front of you. Water rights dispute, he said finally. It went through the county office 3 years ago. My lawyer at the time said it was legitimate. Who was your lawyer? Said the name. Eliza had heard the name. It was one of the names May had mentioned, a lawyer with offices in 2 towns, retainer arrangements with several larger operations in the county. She did not say this to Wyatt. She just looked at him and let the silence carry what she didn't say. He understood. I've been not paying attention, he said. It was a hard thing to say, and he said it plainly, without dressing it up, which she respected. I've had a difficult few years, she said. That's not. He stopped. That's not an excuse for letting the ranch fall apart. No, she agreed. It's not. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she hadn't seen there before, not in the brief exchanges about supplies or the late-night kitchen conversations. It was the look of a man who has been underwater for a long time and has just now, unexpectedly, broken the surface. What would you do, he said, if it were yours? She thought about that. First, I'd get a different lawyer, someone with no connection to Crowley's interests. Then I'd look at the original boundary survey, the one before the reclassification, and find out what was changed and who authorized the change. Then I'd talk to the other ranchers paying into the Redstone Company. Because whatever Crowley is building, he's building it on multiple properties, and the evidence of what he's doing isn't going to be in one place. Wyatt was watching her. And the feed prices, she added. I'd renegotiate with Doyle's. You're a large enough customer that you have leverage. You're just not using it. It was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You've been here 2 weeks. 14 days, she said. And you've figured out more about what's wrong with this ranch than I have in 3 years. You weren't looking, she said. That's different from it not being there to find. Said nothing for a long stretch. The fire made its sounds. Outside, the prairie settled into its late-night quiet. Room off the kitchen, he said finally. It's not big enough. She frowned. It's adequate. There's a larger room on the 2nd floor, east side. Stopped briefly. It's not being used. It's a better room. Better light. He stood up, took his cup to the basin, rinsed it. If you want it. She understood what he wasn't saying, that the room had belonged to someone, and that offering it was not a small thing. I'm fine where I am, she said. I know you are, he said. I'm offering anyway. He went upstairs. She sat at the table for a moment, alone in the kitchen, thinking about boundary surveys and water rights and the particular patience of men like Victor Crowley. Thinking about what she had just set in motion by saying what she'd said, and whether she was ready for what came next. She was not entirely sure she was. She got up anyway. The following week was a different kind of week. Wyatt had not changed overnight. She would not have trusted it if he had. But he was present in a way he hadn't been before. Small things at first. He was at breakfast on time, which he hadn't consistently been. He had 2 conversations with Gideon that she overheard from the kitchen about the cattle rotation and the fencing schedule. That had the quality of a man actually engaged with his own operation, rather than simply signing off on whatever Gideon presented. Gideon noticed. She could tell by the slight adjustment in his posture when Wyatt was around a man recalibrating who was actually in charge. Ranch hands noticed too, though they expressed it differently. It was a settling. Not dramatic, but real the way a room settles when someone who should be in charge walks in and actually takes up the space. Pete Ortega came back to light work on the 15th day, which was exactly when she had said he would. His arm was healing cleanly. He thanked her in the way of someone for whom gratitude was slightly embarrassing, a quick nod, eyes elsewhere, and she accepted it in the same spirit. It was on the 17th day that the trouble from outside arrived. She was in the kitchen, mid-morning, when she heard horses in the yard. Not the ranch hands' horses, those she knew by sound now, the particular rhythms of their coming and going. These were different, more of them, and they came up the road at a pace that was not casual. She looked through the kitchen window. 4 men. She didn't know 3 of them, but the 4th she recognized even from behind the set of his shoulders. Expensive cut of his coat, a hat he'd worn at the auction in Cutter's Bend. Victor Crowley had come to Blackridge Ranch. She moved away from the window, not quickly, and stood in the center of the kitchen and thought for exactly 3 seconds about what she was going to do. Then she untied her apron, folded it over the back of a chair, and walked to the front door. Wyatt was already on the porch. He'd come from the barn, she could see that from the work gloves still in his hand, and he stood at the top of the steps with a stillness that was not a welcoming stillness. Gideon was a few yards back, near the fence post. Caleb and Decker were visible near the barn entrance, not coming closer but not gone either. Crowley dismounted with the ease of a man used to arriving places and having people wait for him. He handed his reins to one of the men with him without looking, and walked toward the porch. His expression was pleasant in the surface way of a man who wears pleasantness as professional equipment. He looked up at Wyatt. His eyes traveled briefly to Eliza standing in the doorway. Something shifted in his face, the smallest thing, gone almost before it was there, and then the surface pleasantness was back. "Callahan," he said. "It's been a while." "It has," Wyatt said, passing through the area. Crowley's voice had the practiced ease of a man who said things that weren't true so often that he no longer noticed the difference. "Thought I'd stop and see how things were at Blackridge." He paused. "Things look better than I expected, honestly." "Ranch is fine," Wyatt said. Crowley's eyes went to Eliza again. Stayed there a moment. "You've got new help." "Yes." "I don't recognize her." He said it like a question wrapped in a statement, which was a technique she recognized, the way of extracting information from people while appearing to simply be making conversation. "She's my cook," Wyatt said. Crowley smiled. It was a very controlled smile. "Name?" Eliza answered for herself, because she was standing right there, and because she was not going to be talked about, as though she weren't. "Eliza Voss," she said. Crowley looked at her for a long moment. She had expected recognition, had prepared herself for it, and she saw it arrive in his eyes before his face caught up and neutralized it. He was good. He was very good. But she had been watching his face since he arrived, and she saw the moment he placed her. "Voss," he said pleasantly. "I don't think I know that name." "Do," she said, "just those 2 words. Simple, level, without heat." Smile stayed exactly where it was. "Well," he looked back at Wyatt. "Just a courtesy call. Water rights renewal is coming up at the quarter. Wanted to make sure everything was in order." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, which he held out toward Wyatt. "New fee schedule. Small increase costs are up across the board." Wyatt took the paper. He looked at it. His expression gave nothing away. "I'll have my lawyer review it," he said. Something moved behind Crowley's pleasantness. Just the faintest disturbance in the surface, like a stone dropped in still water. "Of course," he said. "No rush." He looked around the yard with the ease of a man taking inventory of something he is considering acquiring. "Good cattle country, this stretch. You've held it well." "I intend to keep holding it," Wyatt said. Crowley looked at him. Pleasantness was there. Under it was something else, a patience. The long game. A man who had been doing this for years and knew that it didn't have to happen today. "Of course," he said again. He turned very smoothly and walked back to his horse. His men remounted with him. He paused with one hand on the pommel. "Miss Voss," he said without turning fully. "Welcome to the area." She said nothing. He rode out. The yard was quiet for a moment. Gideon moved first, going to examine something on the fence post that probably didn't need examining. Caleb and Decker disappeared back into the barn. The dust of the departing horses settled slowly. Wyatt came down off the porch and stood beside her. Looked at the road. He knows who you are, he said quietly. Yes, which means he knows you've been talking to me. Possibly, she said. Or he came to check on the ranch and finding me here was unexpected. She paused. But I think the first thing, Wyatt was quiet for a moment. That's why you told me what you told me, when you did. You knew he'd move faster once he knew you were here. She looked at him. Yes, he absorbed this. You could have told me that. Would it have changed anything? He thought about it. No, he admitted. She looked at the road where the dust was still settling. She thought about Crowley's face in the moment he'd recognized her name, that brief, controlled flicker behind his eyes. He had not expected her to be here. That meant he had not been watching her carefully enough, which meant there was still space. Not much, but some. He said the fee renewal is coming, she said. Quarter's end, Wyatt said. 6 weeks. Then we have 6 weeks, she said. Wyatt looked at her. 6 weeks to do what? She thought about her father's journal. About the list of things to repair and things to plant. About a broken thing not being the same as a ruined thing. Make sure that when he moves, she said, he moves against something he didn't count on. She went back inside. The stove needed tending, and it was nearly time to start lunch. There was a great deal to do. Some of it was cooking, and some of it was not, and she had 6 weeks to sort out the difference. Behind her, she heard Wyatt Callahan fold the fee schedule paper once, put it in his pocket. Nah. And when she glanced back through the kitchen window, she saw him standing in the yard with his shoulders back and his head up, looking at his own land like a man who had just remembered that it was his. That was something. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Put the apron back on and got to work. 6 weeks sounds like a long time until you start counting the days. Counted them. She had always been a counter, her father used to say. She came out of the womb taking inventory, and now she kept a running tally in the back of her mind, the way she kept track of flour and salt and the dwindling supply of dried beans. 23 days left after Crowley's visit. Then 20. Then 17. The quarter-end fee renewal was not just a deadline for payment. She understood that now with a clarity that had settled in her chest like cold water. It was a mechanism. A trigger point in whatever Crowley was constructing, the same way the debt on her father's land had been a mechanism, something that looked like routine business, right up until it snapped shut. The day after Crowley rode away from Blackridge, Wyatt sent word to a lawyer in Harmon County named Aldous Fitch. She had suggested Fitch, because May Pruitt had mentioned him obliquely, the way May mentioned most things, by saying he was one of the few men in the territory who had gone up against Crowley's legal arrangements and not immediately folded. He had not won every time, but he had not folded, which May seemed to consider the more significant fact. Fitch wrote back in 4 days. He would come. He had questions. In the meantime, Eliza cooked, and she thought, and she asked careful questions of everyone who came through the kitchen. She had discovered early that a kitchen was the best intelligence-gathering position on any working ranch. People came in hungry. Their defenses were lower, and the act of sitting down and eating made them talk. She did not interrogate anyone. She just listened, and offered seconds, and let the silences sit without filling them. And people filled them for her. What she gathered, piece by piece, was this? Redstone Land and Water Company's hold on the South Fork water rights was shakier than Crowley wanted anyone to know. County reclassification that had established his controlling interest had gone through 3 years ago, during a period when the county assessor's office was understaffed and operating under a temporary director named Harlan Pruitt, no relation to May, who had left the position 18 months later under circumstances that 2 separate people described to her as irregular, and 1 person described more directly as paid off and gone. Reclassification documents were on file at the county office in Millhaven, the nearest town with a proper administrative presence. Wyatt had a copy of the agreement he'd signed with the Redstone Company, kept in a box in his study with other ranch documents. Eliza had not seen it, he had not offered, and she had not asked, but she knew it was there. On the 21st morning after Crowley's visit, Gideon came to her. Came the way he always came now when he had something to say that wasn't about ranch operations through the kitchen in the between hours when nobody else was around. She had noticed this. He had developed, without either of them naming it, a habit of using the kitchen the way she had come to use it herself, as a place where it was somehow easier to say things. I want to tell you something, he said. He sat down at the table, which he had started doing sometimes, though he always looked faintly surprised to find himself there. She poured him coffee without asking. He had started accepting it. Crowley had a man in the Heller outfit, Gideon said. For the last 18 months at least. A hand named Silas Drover. Hellers didn't know until Drover left last spring, and by the time they figured out what he'd been reporting back, the damage was done. He paused. Heller Place went to Crowley's bank in July. Frank Heller's family moved to his wife's brother's place in Colorado. Eliza was quiet. She had heard in passing that the Heller property had changed hands. She had not known the details. "You think there's someone like that here," she said. Gideon looked at his coffee. "I think there might have been," he said. "Before you came." She waited. "One of the hands who left in the spring," he said. "I didn't think anything of it at the time. Men come and go. Close with Drover, I found out later. And some things that shouldn't have gotten out about the ranch's vaginas, about Wyatt's state of mind, after some things Crowley seemed to know about us that he shouldn't have." He paused. "I didn't put it together until recently, but you put it together now." "I'm putting it together now." He looked up. "I should have put it together sooner." "That's what I came to say." She understood what this cost him, a man like Gideon Shaw, for whom being in charge meant being the one who saw things first. Admitting a blind spot was not a small thing. "You're telling me now," she said. "That's what matters." He made the almost smile expression. "You sound like someone's mother." "I sound like someone's daughter," she said, and he had the grace to hear what was underneath that. Finished his coffee and set the cup down. "Fitch is coming this week. Wyatt told me." He paused. "I want to be in that meeting." "That's Wyatt's decision," she said. "I know. I'm telling you because I think you should be in it, too, and Wyatt might not think to say so." She looked at him. After a moment she said, "I'll be in the kitchen." "Kitchen's right next to the study," Gideon said, "and the wall between them is not thick." He stood up. "Just an observation." He left. Eliza stood at the counter and thought that Gideon Shaw was a more complicated man than he had appeared to be at the beginning, which was probably true of most people if you gave them enough time and enough reason to show it. Aldous Fitch arrived on a Thursday, which was the kind of day that was neither the beginning nor the end of anything, just the middle, which suited him. He was older than she'd expected, mid-60s, with a neat white beard and the economy of movement of someone who had learned not to waste energy on things that didn't matter. He wore a suit that was well made but not new, and he carried a leather case that had been repaired at the handle with a strip of darker leather. She liked him for the repaired handle before he said a word. Sat in Wyatt's study with the door almost closed. And Eliza worked in the kitchen. And the wall was, as Gideon had noted, not thick. Fitch asked precise questions. He had a way of asking that did not telegraph where the question was going, which she recognized as the technique of a man who wanted the unguided answer rather than the answer shaped by the question. She listened to Wyatt's responses, halting at first, then more direct, as Fitch's precision seemed to draw precision out of him, and she listened to the places where Wyatt's voice changed when he talked about the water rights agreement, shift in his tone that told her he understood, saying it aloud to this careful man, how thoroughly he'd been managed. Certain point, Fitch said something she couldn't hear clearly. Wyatt's response was too low. Then Wyatt said distinctly, "There's someone else you should talk to." Pause. "She's in the kitchen," Wyatt said. Eliza put down the knife she was using, wiped her hands, and walked to the study door without being summoned twice. Fitch looked at her without the particular wariness that some men of his age deployed when confronted with a woman who was about to tell them something they needed to know. Looked at her the way he'd probably looked at every witness in every proceeding he'd ever been part of, steadily, with the attention of someone for whom information was the actual point. "Wyatt tells me you've been doing some thinking about the Redstone situation," Fitch said. "I've been doing some reading," she said. She told him about the ledger, the margin on the feed costs, the size of the quarterly payment, the consistency of it. She told him what May Pruitt had said about Harlan Pruitt and the reclassification. She told him about Crowley's men being seen near the South Fork boundary. She told him about the Heller Ranch and Silas Drover, which she had heard from Gideon, attributing it to Gideon. Fitch listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Reclassification document," he said. "What do you know about it specifically?" "I know it exists. I know it went through when the county office was understaffed. I know the director who approved it left under irregular circumstances 18 months later." She paused. "I don't know what's in it." "I do," Fitch said. He opened his leather case and removed a folded document. She could see it was a copy, not an original. "I obtained a copy from the county records last month. Not for this case, for another matter that turned out to be related, which is why I agreed to come when Callahan contacted me." He set the document on the desk and smoothed it flat with a careful hand. Reclassification moved the boundary of the South Fork water, access approximately 40 feet east of where the original 1,879 survey placed it. 40 feet doesn't sound like much, but it's enough, she said. It's enough to put the access point on land that Crowley's company controls rather than on Blackridge's eastern boundary. He looked at her. Original survey is on file at the Territorial Land Office. Original survey does not match the reclassification document. Gah. Somebody altered the description of the boundary markers, and it was not done carefully enough. The discrepancy is small, but it's there, in the specific measurements. The room was quiet. Wyatt was looking at the document on his desk. His jaw was set in the way of a man controlling something. Can it be challenged? Wyatt asked. It can, Fitch said. Question is whether we can establish that the alteration was deliberate rather than clerical error, and whether we can connect it to Crowley specifically rather than just to the process. He paused. The director who approved it, Harlan Pruitt, I've been looking for him. It's not easy to find. He's in Dalton Springs, Eliza said. Both men looked at her. May Pruitt mentioned it last week, she said. No relation to him, she said. He moved there after he left the county position. Runs a dry goods store, she held Fitch's gaze. May mentioned it the way you mentioned something you've been sitting on, waiting for someone to ask. Fitch looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote something in the small notebook he carried. Dalton Springs, he said. That's 3 hours by horse. 2.5, she said, if you don't spare the animal. Fitch closed his notebook. He looked at Wyatt. I need 10 days. Possibly 2 weeks. He began returning documents to his case with the same careful economy of motion. In the meantime, do not pay the quarter-end fee. I want you to decline it formally in writing, delivered to the Redstone Company office in Millhaven, citing a pending legal review of the boundary reclassification. Wyatt looked up from the document. That will provoke him, said. It will. That's partly the point. When Crowley is provoked, he moves quickly. When he moves quickly, he makes mistakes he wouldn't make if he had time to be patient. Closed the leather case. Looked at Eliza. Will you still be here in 10 days? It was an interesting question. She considered how to answer it. I work here, she said. Good, said Fitch, and he said it in a way that suggested he meant considerably more than the word on its own. The letter to the Redstone Land and Water Company went out on a Friday. By the following Tuesday, the response had come back not a letter, but a visit. 2 men she didn't recognize rode up to the gate and asked for Callahan. Wyatt met them in the yard. She watched from the kitchen window. Conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. The men rode away without dismounting. Wyatt came back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway. They said the fee is non-negotiable and legal review doesn't constitute grounds for non-payment. What did you say? I said my lawyer would be in touch. He paused. They didn't like that. Good, she said, which was Fitch's word, and she used it in the same way. That evening she went to find old Harris. She had been meaning to have this conversation for some time and had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had arrived the way. Right moments generally did not announced, but simply present. A window that would close again if she didn't move through it. Harris was in the barn, doing something careful and slow with a piece of tack that needed repair. He worked with the particular deliberateness of a man whose hands don't cooperate the way they used to. The tremor was there, slight, constant, but his attention was precise, and the repair looked clean. She sat on a nearby hay bale without asking if she could, glanced at her and kept working. You've been at Blackridge a long time, she said. 12 years, he said. You were here before things changed. It was quiet for a moment. Before Clara died, you mean? She nodded. Clara Wyatt's wife. She had gathered the name over time the way she'd gathered everything else, from the edges of conversations. And the boy, Harris said. He said it quietly, the way you say a thing that still hurts. James. He was 8. She sat with that for a moment. She had not known about the boy, had not heard that mentioned, and now understood why. Some losses are so particular that people around them don't talk about them because there are no adequate words, and the inadequate ones do more harm than silence. I'm sorry, she said. Simple without performance, the way Wyatt had said it to her in the kitchen about her father. Harris kept working on the tack. The water rights dispute started 6 months after Clara died, he said. Wyatt was in no state to fight anything. Gideon tried. But he's a ranch foreman, not a lawyer. Crowley had lawyers everywhere. He paused. I always thought the timing was not accidental. It wasn't, she said. Looked up at her then. You know that for certain? Not with documents yet, she said. But Crowley studies his targets. He would have known about the deaths. He would have known Wyatt was in no position to scrutinize anything. Harris looked at her steadily. His eyes were sharp in the way of very old or very experienced people, the face softened but the intelligence behind it unchanged. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to find the people he's done this to before," she said. "Not just the Heller place, the others, because he didn't build what he's built with 2 ranches. There are others, and some of them have pieces of evidence that don't mean anything on their own, but together." "Together it's a pattern," Harris said. "Together it's a case," she said. Return to the tack. He worked a long stitch in silence. Then he said, "There's a woman in Millhaven, Margaret Coe. Her husband's ranch went to Crowley's bank 4 years ago. She stayed in the county because she had nowhere else to go. She runs a boarding house now." He paused. She never stopped being angry about it. The right kind of angry, not the kind that makes you reckless. Eliza thought about the right kind of angry. She thought she understood what Harris meant. "Do you know her?" "I knew her husband. Good man." He tied off the stitch. "I could write her a letter. She'd talk to me. Would you?" Looked at her again. Something in his face that was quiet and decided. "Wyatt Callahan gave me work when nobody else would," he said. 12 years ago I had a damaged hand and a bad name and no prospects, and he didn't ask about any of it. Just said the ranch needed a man who knew cattle, and whether I was that man." He put the repaired tack down carefully. "So yes, I'll write the letter." She thanked him and left him to it. Zan. On the way back to the house, she stopped for a moment in the yard and looked up at the sky, which was doing something complicated with clouds and early evening light. She was thinking about patterns, about the shape of what Crowley had built and how many pieces of it were out there, scattered across the county in the memories and documents and particular angers of people he had considered permanently neutralized. He had not counted on anyone going to find them. She went to Millhaven herself 4 days later. Wyatt had offered to send someone with her. She had declined. She had not declined out of stubbornness, or not only but because she understood that Margaret Coe would talk differently to one woman alone than to a woman accompanied by a ranch hand who worked for a man like Wyatt Callahan, which carried its own weight and its own complications. She took the wagon. It was a 3-hour drive, and she left before full light, which meant the first hour was cold and the road was barely visible. She spent it thinking about what she was going to say and, more importantly, how she was going to listen. Margaret Coe's boarding house was on the eastern edge of Millhaven, a tidy, narrow structure that had the look of a place run by someone who had very little margin for error and therefore kept everything precisely in order. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 50, with gray at her temples and the kind of careful stillness that comes from having learned to manage strong emotion in a controlled environment. She looked at Eliza for a moment. Then she stepped back and let her in. Harris's letter had arrived the day before. Margaret Coe had been expecting her. Sat in the small parlor that served as the boarding house's social room. Gutted, Eliza told her the shape of what she was trying to do, not all of it, not the legal strategy, but enough. She told her who she was and where she'd come from, and what had happened to her father's land. Gun, and she said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, because she needed Margaret Coe to understand that she was speaking to someone who had lost what she had lost and not to someone conducting an investigation from a comfortable distance. Margaret listened. When Eliza finished, the woman was quiet for almost a full minute, looking at something in the middle distance. "My husband kept records," she said. "He was meticulous that way. Every letter, every contract, every payment receipt. When we lost the property, I managed to take 3 boxes of documents with me, everything I could carry in one trip. Crowley's men were there within an hour of the judgment, and I didn't have time for more." "What's in the boxes?" Eliza asked carefully. "I don't entirely know," Margaret said. "I've gone through some of it. There's correspondence with the water company, the Redstone Company, before it was properly formalized, when it was just a series of letters from a land office in Millhaven that claimed to represent the Creek Authority." She paused. "There are 2 letters from a man named Pruitt, a county official. They're from before the reclassification." Eliza felt something shift, a careful, controlled shift, because she had learned from Fitch the value of not moving too fast when something important presented itself. "Have you read them?" she asked. "Enough to know they were not routine correspondence," Margaret said. "One of them references a payment. Not explicitly, the word payment is never used, but the language is clear enough if you know what you're looking at." Sat in silence for a moment. "Would you be willing to give those letters to a lawyer?" Eliza asked. "A man named Aldous Fitch. He's building a case against Crowley's water rights arrangement. What does he need from me besides the letters? Your account of what happened to the co-property, Eliza said. What was said to you by whom and when, the pattern. She paused. You would not be alone in this. The Heller family situation is part of it. Blackridge Ranch. Others, possibly, that we haven't found yet. Margaret Coe looked at her for a long time. Her face was still in the way of someone who has thought about this for a long time already and is now being asked to move from thinking to doing. Crowley has resources I don't have, she said. If this doesn't work, you're no worse off than you already are, Eliza said. He's already taken what he was going to take from you. What he has that he hasn't taken yet is your silence. Something hardened in Margaret Coe's expression, not anger. Something older and more decided than anger. Come back tomorrow morning, she said. The boxes are in the storage room. I'll have them sorted. Eliza drove back to Blackridge in the afternoon. The light was going flat, and the road was long, and she sat in the wagon seat with the reins in her hands and let herself feel, for the first time in a long while, something that was in the neighborhood of hope without being reckless about it. She would not call it hope out loud. Not yet. She had too much of her father in her for that. 2 days after Millhaven, the rumors started in Cutter's Bend. She heard it first from Caleb, who had gone to town for supplies and come back with provisions and information in roughly equal measure. He told her, while helping carry the boxes in the same casual way he'd told her about Crowley's men near the South Fork matter of fact, like he was reporting the weather. People are saying you came here to make trouble for Crowley, he said. You've been stirring things up since you arrived. That's why it's being manipulated by he stopped. I'm telling you what they said, not what I think. What are they saying I'm manipulating him into? She asked. Legal fight he can't win. Caleb set the last box down. They're saying you've got a personal grudge and you're using Blackridge to settle it. She kept her face even. Who's saying this? Different people. Doyle's mostly. And outside the land office, he looked at her. Didn't sound like it started with those people. Sounded like something they'd heard and were passing along. Because it was, she said. Caleb nodded slowly. Crowley's ahead of this, isn't he? He's been ahead of it since he rode up to this gate and saw me standing in the doorway, she said. Couldn't afford to let me be here quietly. So he's changing the story. Crowley's version, and she could construct it completely, could hear it in the exact tones she'd heard him use on the porch. She was a bitter woman with a personal grievance, using a grieving rancher's trust and a good position in his household to manipulate him into a fight that served her interests and not his. It was a version that was close enough to a distorted truth to be plausible. Left out the ledger under the shelf. In the Heller family in Colorado, Margaret Coe's 3 boxes, in Harlan Pruitt in Dalton Springs. Left out all the actual evidence and replaced it with a story about a woman's anger and a man's vulnerability. It was effective because it was the story people expected. People expected a woman in her position to have motives that were personal and emotional rather than principled and strategic. That expectation was one of Crowley's most reliable tools. She went to find Wyatt. He was in the study. He had been spending more time there lately, not in the absent elsewhere way of the first weeks, but working, going through documents, writing letters, having conversations with Fitch by post. He had the look of a man who was angry in the specific way of someone who has understood they were complacent and can't go back to that complacency. She told him what Caleb had said, all of it, including the part about manipulation, because he needed to hear it plainly and from her rather than sideways from someone else. He listened without looking away from her. When she was done, he said, Is any of it true? Personal grievance is real, she said. I won't pretend otherwise. Crowley took my father's land. That's not nothing, and it doesn't disappear because it's inconvenient to admit. She paused. The evidence is real, too. The reclassification document is real. Margaret Coe's letters are real. The discrepancy in the survey measurements is real. My grievance doesn't make those things less real. Wyatt was quiet. If you want to separate what I've built here from what I'm doing about Crowley, she said, I understand that. I don't think it serves the ranch, but I understand it. That's not what I'm asking, he said. Then what are you asking? He looked at her. I'm asking if you trust that what we're doing is going to work. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which was harder than giving him a reassuring answer, and she respected him enough not to do that. I trust that the evidence is real, she said. I trust that Fitch is good at what he does. I trust that Crowley has been overconfident for long enough that there are gaps in what he thinks he's hidden. She paused. Whether that's enough, I don't know. I think it might be. I've been wrong before. He nodded. Not satisfied exactly, but settled by the honesty. Going to come at you directly, Wyatt said. The rumors are the first move. Next move will be worse. I know. Are you ready for that? She thought about the morning of the auction. Her father's land going for less than it was worth. Face-down photograph. The walk north along the road with a bag that got heavier with every mile. I've already had the worst thing happen, she said. Just what comes after. He accepted this, turned back to the document he'd been reading, then stopped. Room on the second floor, he said. You never took it. I said I was fine where I was. You said that, he agreed. But you've been here long enough now that it's not about whether you're comfortable. It's about, he seemed to be finding the words. This house is big enough that there's no reason for you to be sleeping in the smallest room in it. She looked at him for a moment. Are you asking me to take it or telling me? Corner of his mouth moved. I'm asking. Then I'll think about it, she said, and she left him to his documents. She went back to the kitchen and stood there for a moment. Through the window, the late afternoon was long and gold across the yard. Decker was fixing something at the fence line. Caleb was bringing the horses in. Sounds of the ranch, steady, purposeful, changed from the aimless friction of those first weeks, were around her like something solid. Crowley was rewriting the story of what she was and why she was here. He was telling it to the town, and the town was listening, the way towns listen to powerful men who told them things they half expected to hear anyway. She needed the truth to be louder than his version of it. That meant she needed Margaret Coe's documents in Fitch's hands, and Fitch needed to find Harlan Pruitt in Dalton Springs. And Harlan Pruitt needed to be the kind of man who still had enough conscience left to tell the truth when it was finally asked for. She needed to do all of this before the quarter-end fee deadline, which was now 11 days away, before Crowley made his next move, which would come sooner than 11 days. And she knew it. She put water on for coffee, because she needed to think. And she needed something to do with her hands while she thought. Some problems were best approached with a hot cup and a long, clear look at exactly how much trouble you were in. She was in quite a lot of trouble. She had known that since she walked through the gate with the broken latch. She had come anyway. That was the only answer she had ever had. She had come anyway. She kept coming. Outside, the sun went lower and the yard went golden, and the day kept moving forward without asking anyone's permission, which was the one thing you could always count on the day to do. The letter arrived 8 days before the quarter-end deadline, and it was not from Fitch. It was from the county sheriff's office in Millhaven, and it was addressed to Wyatt Callahan, and it informed him, in the precise and airless language of official correspondence, that a formal complaint had been filed against one Eliza Voss, currently residing at Blackridge Ranch, alleging fraudulent misrepresentation of employment qualifications, unlicensed medical practice in connection with the treatment of a ranch hand, grand interference with lawful business operations of the Redstone Land and Water Company. Complaint requested that Miss Voss present herself at the Millhaven Sheriff's Office within 5 days to provide a statement, and noted that failure to appear could result in a warrant being issued. Wyatt read it twice. Then he set it on the kitchen table in front of Eliza without a word and waited. She read it once. She set it down. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. Unlicensed medical practice, she said. Pete Ortega's arm, Wyatt said. I cleaned and bound a wound. She looked at the letter again. There was no doctor available. He would have developed an infection. I know that. The fraudulent misrepresentation. Said you had experience running a household and cooking for a crew, Wyatt said. Which was true. Which was entirely true. She pushed the letter slightly away from her, the way you push something that is trying to occupy more space than it deserves. Interference with lawful business operations is the real charge. Others are decoration. Wyatt pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He had a particular way of sitting when he was thinking through something difficult, elbows on the table, hands loosely clasped, looking at the middle distance. She had come to recognize it. He's trying to remove you from the board, he said before the hearing.
Yes.
If you go to Millhaven to give a statement, you're away from here for at least 2 days. If they find a reason to detain you, they won't find a legal reason, she said. They don't necessarily need one to slow things down. She thought about the timeline. 8 days to the deadline. Fitch was in Dalton Springs, or had been she had not heard from him in 3 days, which was either because he was occupied with Harlan Pruitt or because something had gone wrong, and she was trying not to think too carefully about the second possibility. Margaret Coe's documents were with Fitch's clerk in Millhaven. Harris had written his letter, and Margaret Coe had responded, and there was a thread connecting these pieces, but threads could be cut. Crowley was moving faster than she had expected. She had told Wyatt he would, but she had still expected more time. Go, Wyatt said. She looked at him. Not yet. Send a written response through Fitch's office, acknowledge the summons. Say you'll appear with legal representation. Request a postponement pending the outcome of existing legal proceedings. He paused. That buys time, and it's not refusal. You've been talking to Fitch. I've been reading what Fitch writes, he said. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm not entirely useless in this. I never said you were useless, she said. You never said I was useful either. She looked at him across the table. In the weeks since she had arrived at Blackridge, the distance between where he had been that underwater, elsewhere version of himself she had glimpsed in those first days, and where he was now had become something she didn't often let herself look at directly. Because looking at it directly would require acknowledging that she was partly responsible for it, and she wasn't sure what to do with that yet. Write the response today, she said. Fitch's address. Your signature as my employer confirming the legal representation. Already drafting it in my head, he said. He stood up, took the letter from the table, and left for the study. Eliza sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes. She was thinking about Crowley's timing. Complaint had been filed not when she first arrived, not when she'd told Wyatt about the ledger, not even after Crowley's visit to the ranch, but now, 8 days before the deadline, after Fitch had gone to Dalton Springs, and after the rumors in Cutter's Bend had not succeeded in isolating her. He had waited to see if the softer pressure would work. It hadn't. So now he was using the mechanism of official process, which was slower and messier, but harder to simply walk away from. He was good at this. She had always known he was good at this. She got up and went to find Gideon. Gideon was in the yard, going over the rotation schedule with Decker, and he read her expression before she opened her mouth. He said something brief to Decker that ended the conversation and walked toward her. She told him about the letter. He listened with his arms crossed, which was his thinking posture, as much as his defensive one. She had learned the difference. Going after your credibility, Gideon said when she was done. He's going after my presence, she said. The credibility is the tool. Same result. He looked past her toward the road. The hands are going to hear about this. I know. Some of them are going to wonder. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Pete won't wonder, he said. Talks. He said it simply like a practical observation, which it was. I'm not asking you to manage what the men think, she said. I know you're not. He looked at her directly. I'm telling you what I'm going to do anyway. Because the last thing this ranch needs is the crew fracturing over something Crowley manufactured. He paused. And because it's the right thing. She accepted this in the spirit it was offered. Gideon Shaw's version of support didn't look like other people's versions of support. It looked like a foreman deciding what served the operation and acting on that decision. But it was real. She had learned not to require it to look a particular way to count it. Something else, she said. I need you to keep an eye on who comes to the gate. Anyone asking questions about me, about Wyatt, about what we're doing with the water rights. Crowley will want information and he'll find ways to get it. Already doing that, he said. Since the rumors started, he uncrossed his arms. Think he has someone inside again? I think he'll try, she said. Whether he's succeeded, I don't know. He nodded once, slowly. I'll handle it. She went back inside. At the kitchen counter she stood for a moment, hands flat on the wood, and took a breath that was slower than her thoughts were moving. Problem with being the person who could see the shape of what was coming was that you had to live in it before it arrived, which was a particular kind of exhaustion. She started on lunch. There were 13 people to feed, and the day wasn't going to pause for any of this, and the act of making something useful with her hands was the best thing she could do with the next 2 hours. Fitch's letter arrived the following morning. It had been written in Dalton Springs and posted 3 days ago, which meant he had written it shortly after arriving. Pruitt is here. He is not the man Crowley thinks he is anymore, if he ever was. He has been carrying what he did for 3 years, and it has not sat well with him. Requires careful handling, but he is not unwilling. I expect to have a signed statement within 2 days of this writing. Statement, combined with the boundary documents and the co-correspondence, gives us what we need for the Territorial Land Office complaint. County hearing is secondary. We file with the territory first and let that proceeding pressure the county rather than the reverse. Not pay the fee, hold the line. She read it 3 times. Then she took it to Wyatt. He read it once and set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not want to show how much he needed to read those words. 2 days from when he wrote it, he said. Which means, you may already have it, she said. Or something went wrong. Or something went wrong, she agreed. But Fitch is not a man who telegraphs optimism he doesn't have. If he says Pruitt is not unwilling, Pruitt is not unwilling. Wyatt turned the letter over in his hands, not reading it again, just holding it. Harlan Pruitt altered a boundary document for money, he said. Left his position under what did you call it, irregular circumstances. Why would he talk now? Because Crowley is still doing it, she said. And Pruitt is in Dalton Springs running a dry goods store. And whatever he was paid 3 years ago is long spent. And he is watching from a distance as a man he helped build does the same thing to other people. Over and over. There is a particular weight to that kind of watching. She paused. Some people can carry that indefinitely. Some people reach a point where someone knocking on their door and asking them directly is the thing they've been waiting for without knowing it. Wyatt looked at her. You're very certain about how people work. I'm not certain, she said. I'm hopeful. There's a difference. He was quiet. Then the hearing at the county office. Fitch says it's secondary, but Crowley will make a show of it regardless. Yes. He'll bring his lawyer. He'll have people there. He'll expect me to be flustered by the process, she said. He'll expect me to be alone or near it, with a case that isn't fully built yet, facing his machinery on his timeline. She paused. Which is why we don't go on his timeline. Wyatt looked at her. You want to move the hearing? I want to go to the county office before the hearing is scheduled and request that the proceeding be delayed pending the Territorial Land Office complaint. Fitch can file the territory complaint from Dalton Springs before he comes back. The territorial filing is in motion. The county is obligated to acknowledge it. She paused. Doesn't stop the hearing. But it changes what the hearing is about. Instead of being about whether I've overstepped, it becomes about a much larger question of land fraud across multiple properties. Wyatt thought about it. Crowley will know what we're doing. He already knows what we're doing. The question is whether he can stop it before it's in motion. She looked at him steadily. I want to go to Millhaven tomorrow. With you, he held her gaze. With me. You're a property owner of standing in this county. I'm a woman with an official complaint against her name. Meeting lands differently if you're in the room. He accepted this without apparent offense, which he had come to understand was one of his better qualities, the ability to hear a practical truth without needing it to be softened first. What time do you want to leave? Before the town is fully awake, she said. First light. They left at first light. Gideon had the horses ready before she'd finished her coffee, which meant he had been up earlier than first light and had not required explaining to. She was beginning to understand that Gideon's version of loyalty was logistical and silent and nearly absolute. Drive to Millhaven was 2.5 hours, the road uneven in the early morning cold, the sky doing slow things with gray and pink above the ridge. Wyatt drove. She sat beside him, and they talked not about strategy, not about Crowley, but about smaller things. She asked about the ranch's history, the early years, how he had come to this particular land. Told her in the spare way of a private man who was deciding in real time how much to say. He had come from Ohio, which surprised her. He didn't seem like a man from Ohio. Said that was fair, because he hadn't been a man from Ohio for a very long time. He had come west at 22 with specific intention of becoming someone the Ohio version of himself wouldn't have recognized. He had worked ranches for 5 years before he had enough to start his own. He had met Clara in Millhaven at a dance he had only attended because someone else hadn't wanted to go alone. He said this last thing briefly and matter-of-factly, and she received it the same way, without pressing. Boy, she said after a moment. She had not brought up James before. She brought him up now because Harris had told her, and because she thought Wyatt probably needed someone to be able to say the name to. He was quiet for a stretch. The horses kept their pace. He was 8, he said. Same fever that took Clara. Went within 10 days of each other. He paused. People said it was a mercy that they were together. I didn't find that comforting. No, she said, I imagine not. He looked like her, Wyatt said, just that. Just those 4 words. She said nothing. She had learned that some things needed the silence more than they needed a response. After a while he said, Your father. What was he like? Stubborn, she said immediately. Particular about fence posts. Couldn't cook a decent meal to save himself. She paused. He made lists, constant lists, of everything that needed doing and everything he was grateful for and everything he'd noticed that day. When he died, I found a journal that was mostly lists. She thought about the flat rock on the road north of Cutter's Bend and reading her father's words in the early morning heat. He wrote that I was better at the ranch than I knew. I don't know if it was true or if he was just being a father, but I've thought about it a lot since. True, Wyatt said. She looked at him. I've been watching you for 5 weeks, he said. True. She turned her eyes back to the road. The sky had resolved itself into a flat, clear blue that meant a cold day staying cold. She did not say anything, but something in her chest moved in a way she had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with. They drove the rest of the way into Millhaven, mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the silences at the beginning. County Administrative Office opened at 8. We're there at 7:45, which meant they were first, which was the point. Clerk who unlocked the door was a young man who looked at Wyatt with recognition, a rancher of standing, someone he knew by name, and at Eliza with the slightly complicated expression of someone who had probably heard the rumors and was trying to reconcile them with the woman standing in front of him. She gave him nothing to reconcile. She simply stated what they were there for, in the clear and orderly way of someone who expected to be served without difficulty. The office manager arrived at 8:10. He was a careful man named Gould, built entirely for administrative procedure, who listened to their request for postponement with the expression of someone trying to determine which way the wind was going. Wyatt presented the letter from Fitch's office confirming the pending territorial filing. Gould read it twice. The territorial complaint hasn't been officially received yet, Gould said. Will be filed today or tomorrow, Wyatt said. Fitch is traveling from Dalton Springs. Until it's received, I can't formally. I understand, Wyatt said. I'm asking you to note on the record that the filing is pending. Postponement request goes into the official rec now, and if the territorial complaint arrives before the scheduled hearing, the postponement is activated. Gould looked at the letter again. He looked at Wyatt. He looked briefly at Eliza. Whatever calculation he was performing, it was visible on his face in the way of a man who was not practiced at hiding them. I'll note it, he said finally. On the record, he paused. Complaint against Miss Voss remains active until the matter is formally reviewed. Understood, Wyatt said. They left the office at 8:40. On the street outside. Town of Millhaven was properly awake now, people moving. General store open. The wagon being loaded outside the feed supplier down the road. Eliza stood on the board sidewalk and breathed the cold air and felt the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from doing too much, but from holding too much at once. It's not over, she said. No, Wyatt agreed. Crowley will know we were here today within a few hours. Probably. He was looking down the street toward nothing in particular. Are you hungry? She blinked. What? We've been traveling since before dawn. Diner on the corner serves breakfast until 10. He glanced at her. We have a 2.5-hour drive back. You should eat. She almost argued with him. Then she thought about it and said, yes, I'm hungry. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon and the particular comfort of a working kitchen. They took a table near the window and ordered without consulting each other particularly, which was one of those small intimacies that arrive before you have named them. She had eggs and bread and black coffee. He had the same. They were almost done when the door opened, and a man walked in who made Eliza set her coffee cup down very carefully. She didn't know him. He was perhaps 45. With the look of a professional man, a coat that was well made, a watch chain, a hat he removed when he entered. He scanned the room and found them, and there was nothing accidental about the finding. Came directly to their table. Mr. Callahan, he said. My name is Dewhurst. I represent Victor Crowley's legal interests in Harmon and Millhaven County. He did not look at Eliza when he said this, which was itself a communication. I wonder if I might have a word. You can have several, Wyatt said. Sit down. Dewhurst sat. He had a folder with him, which he placed on the table but did not open. He was the kind of lawyer whose confidence came from the weight of money behind him rather than from personal certainty, and Eliza had seen that kind before. Were effective in a particular range of situations and brittle outside of it. My client is concerned, Dewhurst said, that the current situation is heading toward a confrontation that serves no one. Water rights matter is a settled legal question. Reclassification was properly conducted. My client has no interest in prolonged litigation. He paused, prepared to offer a modified fee arrangement, a 20% reduction in the quarterly rate, a 5-year lock against increases in exchange for a withdrawal of any pending challenges to the Redstone Company's authority over the South Fork access. Wyatt looked at him. And the complaint against Miss Voss? Drawn, Dewhurst said, immediately. The table was quiet. Outside the window, Millhaven went about its morning. Eliza looked at Dewhurst. He was still not looking at her. "Why is your client offering this now?" she asked. Dewhurst shifted his gaze to her with the faint reluctance of a man who had hoped to conduct this negotiation without engaging with a particular party directly. "Timing is simply, he knows Fitch has Pruitt's statement," she said. "Or he suspects it. He's offering a settlement because he's concerned about what the testimony contains." She kept her voice level and her eyes steady. 20% reduction and 5 years of locked rates is still paying for something you don't owe. It's still acknowledging Crowley's authority over water that runs through Blackridge's own boundary. Dewhurst looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Miss Voss, a bird in hand, is still in someone else's hand," she said. "Problem." She looked at Wyatt. This was his decision. It was his ranch and his water and his 5 weeks of rebuilt momentum, and she would not take this from him. Wyatt looked at the folder on the table, which Dewhurst had not opened. Then he looked at Dewhurst. "Tell your client thank you for the offer," he said. "We'll be in touch through Fitch's office." Dewhurst's professional composure held, but only barely. Picked up the folder, stood, put his hat back on. "Mr. Callahan, this offer has a shelf life." "Most things do," Wyatt said. Dewhurst left. They watched him go through the diner window down the boardwalk, around the corner, gone. Eliza realized she was holding her coffee cup in both hands and had been since Dewhurst sat down. She set it on the table. "He came to the right place at the right time to find us," she said. "He followed us from the county office," Wyatt said. "Yeah, or had someone watching for us. Which means Crowley knows about the Gould meeting." She thought about what that meant for the timeline. He's moving faster now. The settlement offer means the Pruitt statement has reached him somehow. Either Fitch contacted him as a courtesy before filing, which Fitch might do for procedural reasons, or Crowley has his own sources in Dalton Springs. Can he stop the filing? Not if Fitch has already sent it to the territory. She looked at the window. Fitch hasn't confirmed that yet. They paid and left. On the road back to Blackridge, the cold had settled in properly, and the sky was the flat, brilliant blue of a winter day, pretending to be warmer than it was. Eliza sat with her hands in her lap and worked through the shape of where things stood. They were close. She believed that. Fitch had Pruitt's statement, or was hours from having it. But Margaret Coe's letters were in Fitch's clerk's possession. The boundary discrepancy existed in a document filed at the Territorial Land Office, a document that could be checked against the original 1,879 survey by anyone with access. Machinery was in motion. But Crowley was moving too, and he had more resources and more reach, and the settlement offer this morning was not the last move he was going to make. They were an hour from Blackridge when they saw the smoke. It was not the smoke of a cook fire or a burn pile. Darker and heavier, and it was coming from the direction of the ranch, and Eliza felt it before she consciously processed it, a dropping sensation, a sudden cold clarity. Wyatt saw it at the same moment. He didn't say anything. Urged the horses faster. The fire was not the house. Duckwin. That was the first thing she registered as they came through the gate. The house was standing. The barn was standing. The smoke was coming from the east field, from the direction of the south fence line. As they kept the road, Gideon was already there with half the crew, and the fence line was burning. Not the fence. Precisely the dry grass on the Crowley side of the south boundary. Started at multiple points, which meant it had not been accidental. It had been set to burn against the fence and into the east field, and it had taken the eastern corner of the fence line completely. Men had beaten it back before it crossed properly into Blackridge's grazing land, but barely. Gideon met them as Wyatt pulled up. His face was black with smoke, and his expression was the hardest she had seen it. 3 separate start points, he said. "I found what's left of 2 torches near the boundary markers." He looked at Wyatt. It was from the Crowley side. Wyatt was down from the wagon before it fully stopped. Looked at the burned fence line, the scorched grass, the men still working at the edges with wet sacks. Jaw was set. "Anyone hurt?" "No," Gideon said. "Caleb saw the smoke first, got us out there fast." He paused. "Miss Voss." He said her name in a particular way, not an address, more like a punctuation mark before something important. "While you were in Millhaven, a man came to the gate. Said he was looking for work. I didn't like the look of him. Sent him off. An hour later, the fire started. He met her eyes. He was watching the gate, watching for you to leave." She took this in. She stood in the cold afternoon with the smell of burned grass around her and the damaged fence line 40 yards away, and she thought about the shape of what had just happened. Crowley had tried the legal mechanism. It hadn't stopped her. Tried the settlement offer. That hadn't stopped her either. Now he was burning fence lines and sending watchers to count who was at the ranch and who was gone. He was running out of the patient moves. That meant he was getting closer to the impatient ones. Wyatt came back to where she was standing. He had soot on his hands from touching the fence post, and he looked at it briefly and then at her. He wanted to scare us, he said. Yes, she said. Work? She looked at the burned grass, the damaged posts, the crew still working. She looked at the house, standing. The barn, standing. Water in the creek, still running. All the things that were still intact. Not enough, she said. She went inside and started dinner, because 13 people had worked a hard afternoon and they needed feeding, me, and because the act of feeding people was the most direct thing she could do with the anger that was moving through her like something with edges. She cut the potatoes faster than was strictly necessary. The pan on the stove with more force than she intended. She stood at the counter and breathed through her nose and remembered what Harris had called the right kind of angry, not the reckless kind. Not the kind that made you stupid, but the kind that clarified things. Kind that made you very, very certain about what needed to happen next. Fitch needed to file the territorial complaint. It needed to happen before Crowley found another lever to pull, before the hearing was forced on Crowley's schedule, before the fence lines started meaning something worse than burned grass. She sent a rider to Millhaven with a letter for Fitch's clerk that night, after dinner, after the men had eaten and the kitchen was clean. The letter was brief. It said, "File now. Whatever you have, file it. We are out of time for patience." She sealed it, handed it to Caleb, who asked no questions and rode out into the dark without hesitating. She stood in the doorway after he left, looking at the night. Stars were very clear and very cold, and the prairie stretched away from the house in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the way it always was. She was not afraid. She wanted to make that clear to herself, to take inventory of what she was actually feeling, rather than what the situation suggested she should be feeling. She was not afraid. She was tired. She was angry. And she was uncertain about several things. And underneath all of it, somewhere she didn't examine too often, she was something she had not been in a long time. She was not alone in it. That was new. That was, if she was honest, most disorienting thing about the last 5 weeks, not the danger, not the complexity of what she was trying to do, but the fact that there were people around her who had decided to stand in the same direction she was standing. Gideon, who kept watch without being asked. Harris, who wrote a letter with damaged hands. Caleb, who rode into the dark without questions. Margaret Coe, who had been waiting 3 years for someone to ask. And Wyatt, who was not the man she'd been warned about. Not only who had come back to the surface of his own life and was standing in it now with both feet, looking at his burned fence line with the expression of a man who had stopped being willing to absorb whatever was thrown at him. She went back inside. She put out the lamp. She went to her room, the small room off the kitchen, not the larger one on the second floor, not yet, and she lay down and she was asleep before the thought that was forming about the second floor had completed itself. Outside, the prairie settled. The stars moved in their slow arcs. 3 days away, in Dalton Springs, Aldous Fitch was sitting across a table from a man named Harlan Pruitt, who had been carrying a wrong thing for 3 years and was finally, carefully, putting it down. And in the county seat of the territory, the land office would open in the morning and would receive what was coming. Machinery of something larger than one man's patience would begin slowly to turn. Fitch arrived at Blackridge 2 days after Caleb rode out with the letter, and he did not arrive alone. Came with Harlan Pruitt. Eliza was in the yard when they rode up, carrying a bucket from the well, and she stopped when she saw the second horse. Pruitt was a slight man, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the look of someone who had spent years trying to take up less space than his body naturally occupied. He sat his horse carefully, like a man who was not entirely sure he had made the right decision and was still deciding whether to turn around. Guys found her first. Before Fitch had even dismounted, she held his gaze steadily and without accusation, because she understood that accusation was the thing most likely to send him back to Dalton Springs and his dry goods store and his careful, diminished life. Fitch dismounted with the economy of a man who had been on a horse for many hours. He looked tired but not uncertain, which she read as a good sign. "Wanted to come," Fitch said quietly, as he handed his reins to Caleb. "I didn't suggest it," he asked. She looked at Pruitt again, climbed down and was standing beside his horse with his hat in his hands, turning it once slowly. Was a gesture. She recognized the gesture of a man who has something to say and is gathering himself for the saying of it. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "come inside. I'll put coffee on." Nodded once and followed her. Wyatt was in the study. She went to the doorway and said simply, "Fitch is here." Pruitt came with him. Wyatt looked up from whatever he had been reading and set it down without marking his place. They gathered in the kitchen, all of them, because the kitchen was where things happened at Blackridge, and everyone seemed to understand this by now. Fitch took the chair closest to the window. Pruitt sat where Eliza pointed, at the end of the table, and kept his hat in his hands. Wyatt sat across from him. Gideon stood near the door, which was his way of being present without crowding. Eliza poured coffee for everyone and sat down. Pruitt spoke first, which surprised her. She had expected Fitch to manage the introduction, to ease the man into it. But Pruitt seemed to have made his decision somewhere on the road and was not going to let himself back away from it. "I altered the boundary description," he said. He said it to Wyatt directly, which took something. In the reclassification document, the measurements were changed 41 feet, the eastern marker. "I wrote the new figures into the official record, and I certified them as accurate. They were not accurate." He paused. He was not looking at his hat anymore. He was looking at the table. "I was paid $300. Crowley's man brought it in cash, in an envelope, and I told myself it was a clerical adjustment that didn't matter much either way." He stopped again. "I knew it wasn't." The kitchen was very quiet. $300, Wyatt said. Not with judgment, just placing the fact in the room. "I had debts," Pruitt said. "That's not an excuse." "I know that." He finally looked up. "I've been waiting for someone to come knock on my door for 3 years. When your lawyer showed up, I thought it would be someone from Crowley. I almost didn't open the door." He looked at Fitch. "Then he told me what he was actually there for, and I sat down at my kitchen table, and I couldn't get up for about 20 minutes. Fitch said, "The statement is signed and witnessed. It details the payment, the instruction, specific alteration, in the name of Crowley's man who delivered the money." He opened his leather case and placed several documents on the table. Combined with the co-correspondence and the original 1,879 survey discrepancy, the Territorial Land Office has enough to open a formal investigation into the reclassification. He paused. "I filed yesterday morning. The complaint is registered." Words sat in the room like something solid. Eliza looked at the documents on the table without touching them. She thought about the auction in Cutter's Bend, the face-down photograph, the road north that she had walked without knowing where she was going. She thought about the gate with the broken latch and the collapsed fence rails and the kitchen that smelled of weevil-damaged flour. She thought about all the small things that had brought her to this table, in this kitchen, with this particular collection of people around it. "What happens now?" Wyatt asked. "The investigation takes time," Fitch said. "Weeks, possibly months, before a formal ruling. But the filing itself triggers a stay on the quarter-end fee the Redstone Company cannot collect, while a territorial investigation into the legitimacy of their water rights is active. That's immediate." He looked at Wyatt. "You don't pay the fee. Legally, formally, you don't pay it." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Crowley will be notified of the investigation by the Territorial Office. He'll respond through lawyers, he always does. Dewhurst will file objections." Fitch paused. "The objections go into the record. The investigation goes forward. And Pruitt's statement is now part of a territorial proceeding, which means it cannot be made to disappear." Pruitt flinched slightly at his own name. Then he straightened. It was a small thing, but Eliza noticed it, the decision, made in real time, to sit with what he'd done rather than away from it. "There's one more thing," Fitch said. He looked at Eliza. "Complaint against you has been officially withdrawn. I received notice this morning. Crowley's office withdrew it before the territorial filing was even confirmed, which suggests he knew it was coming and decided the complaint was more liability than asset, once legal proceedings were formally in motion." She had expected to feel more when she heard that. What she actually felt was a kind of flatness, not relief, exactly, but the absence of a weight she had become so accustomed to that she had stopped distinguishing it from her regular state. She nodded. "Thank you," she said. "Fitch," and then, looking at Pruitt, "both of you." Pruitt looked at her. "I'm not sure I deserve that." "Came," she said. "You didn't have to. You could have stayed in Dalton Springs and kept your store, and nobody would have forced you into this room." She paused. "You made a wrong choice 3 years ago, and you made a right one now. People don't often get that chance." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at his hat, which he was still holding, set it carefully on the table, as if setting something down that he had been carrying for a long time. News traveled the way. News traveled in that part of the country faster than logic suggested it should. Through networks of people who talked to other people, who talked to people who stopped at roadside, stands and fed stores, and the counter at Doyle's General Store in Cutter's Bend. By the end of the week, following Fitch's filing, most of the county knew that a territorial investigation into the Redstone Land and Water Company was underway. By the end of the week after that, 2 other ranchers had contacted Fitch, independently the Donahue family from east of Millhaven, and an older man named Creed, who ran a small operation 20 miles south and had been paying into the Redstone Company for 3 years, with the resigned acceptance of someone who has been told, repeatedly, that the arrangement is legal and unassailable. Neither of them had known the others were paying. Crowley had been careful about that, careful to keep his arrangements separate, to present each family with the impression that they were in a unique situation rather than part of a pattern. Was, Eliza thought, most revealing thing about how he operated, the effort he put into making his victims feel alone. Isolated people don't compare notes. They don't find each other. They absorb what's done to them in private, and they survive it or they don't. She thought about this when she wrote to Margaret Coe to tell her about the filing. Margaret wrote back within 4 days, a short letter, not effusive, the kind of letter written by someone who had learned to keep her hope in careful portions. She said, "I didn't let myself believe it would go this far. I'm still not believing it completely. But I'm glad you knocked on my door." Eliza kept that letter in her father's journal, tucked between 2 pages. County hearing was held 3 weeks after the territorial filing, and it was a different proceeding than it would have been if Crowley had gotten his timing right. Hearing room at the Millhaven County office was not large. It had wooden benches that held perhaps 40 people and a raised table at the front for the panel of 3 county officials who would hear the matter. When Eliza arrived with Wyatt and Fitch, she was not prepared for how many people were already there. Margaret Coe was there, in a dark dress, sitting straight-backed in the second row. Gold Harris was there, which had required someone to drive him, and she saw from the set of his jaw that the drive had cost him something physically, and he had come anyway. Donahue family, a husband and wife and their adult son, were there in the row behind Margaret. Creed, the older man from the South operation, was there near the back. And there were others she did not recognize, people who had come because word had spread, because the shape of what Crowley had built was becoming visible in ways that individual silence had prevented for years. Stood at the door for a moment and looked at all of it. Wyatt was beside her. He saw what she was seeing. "You did this." "They did this," she said. "I just went and knocked on doors." "That's not a small thing," he said. She didn't argue with him. She went in. Crowley was already there. He sat with Dewhurst on the left side of the room, at a table parallel to Fitch's, and he was wearing his expensive coat and his careful pleasantness and his expression of a man who has not yet decided to be concerned. Looked at Eliza when she entered. She looked back at him without expression and took her seat. Panel opened the hearing with the formal language of official proceedings, recitation of the matter, the parties, the scope of what was being examined. Panel chair, a woman named Birch whom Eliza had not seen before. It had the quality of someone who ran meetings without allowing them to drift, which Eliza respected immediately. Fitch presented first. He was methodical and precise in the way she had come to expect from him, not theatrical, not performing for the room, just presenting facts in the order that made their collective weight most visible. Original 1,879 survey and the discrepancy in the reclassification document. A signed statement from Harlan Pruitt, who was present and whom Fitch indicated with a brief nod toward the bench where Pruitt sat, alone, looking like a man at his own reckoning. Correspondence between Crowley's intermediaries and the Redstone Company officers in the period leading up to the reclassification. Co-documents, which laid out in Margaret Coe's husband's own careful handwriting the sequence of pressure and manipulation that had preceded the loss of the Coe property. Dewhurst objected several times, in the precise and technical way of a man working from a playbook. Birch overruled most of them. Then Fitch did something that Eliza had not known he was going to do. Called her to speak. She had not prepared a speech. She had known she might be asked to give her account of events, her own history, with Crowley, the Voss foreclosure, her arrival at Blackridge, and she had thought about how to tell it. But she had not thought about how to tell it to a room full of people, some of whom she knew and many of whom she didn't, all of whom were listening with the particular attention of people who are trying to decide what to believe. She stood at the front of the room, and she told it plainly. She told it the way her father had written his lists, without embellishment, just the facts in order. Death of Thomas Voss, the foreclosure process, and the fee dispute that had preceded it, and the way each piece of pressure had arrived just as they were recovering from the last one. Auction and the price the land went for, and the fist-down photograph. Road north. May Pruitt, the gate with the broken latch. She told it without asking for sympathy, which was, she had learned, the fastest way to earn it. She said, I came to Blackridge Ranch because I needed work. I stayed because I found things that needed doing, and I am not made for leaving things undone. When I found the ledger under the pantry shelf and saw what the water rights fees were costing the ranch, I didn't act on it immediately. I thought about whether it was my business. I decided it was, because a wrong thing doesn't stop being wrong, because it's inconvenient to say so. She looked at Crowley when she said this last part. He was looking at the table in front of him. His face was controlled, and she could not read it, and she had stopped trying. I am not here to claim that what happened to my father's land is what this hearing is about, she said. Isn't. This hearing is about a pattern of land fraud across multiple properties, documented across multiple years, perpetrated through the corruption of a county official and the manipulation of water rights that people depend on to run viable ranches. She paused. I'm here because I was in a position to see it, and I wasn't willing to pretend I hadn't. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Not the held-breath quiet of drama, but something more settled the quiet of people who have just heard something said plainly that they had needed to hear plainly for a long time. Dewhurst's response was technically accomplished and largely beside the point. Challenged the Pruitt statement on grounds of the witness's admitted participation in the act he was testifying about self-interested testimony, compromised credibility. Challenged the COO documents on chain of custody. Presented a counter-survey conducted by a surveyor whose name Fitch noted, for the record, appeared on a list of contractors with documented business relationships with Crowley's land holdings. Birch noted this in return. Dewhurst moved on. Crowley did not speak. He sat through the proceeding with the patience of a man who had been through processes before and understood them, and he let Dewhurst carry the weight. And his face remained controlled and almost pleasant right up until the moment Birch called a brief recess. Eliza stepped outside into the cold air during the recess. She stood on the board sidewalk and looked at the street, which was going about its business with the indifference of places that have things to do, regardless of what is happening in the county office 3 doors down. She heard footsteps and turned. It was not who she expected. Crowley. He had come out a side door and he was alone. No Dewhurst, no coat, just a man in shirt sleeves in the cold who had walked out of a room where things were not going his way and needed a moment that was not surveilled. He looked at her with something she had not seen on his face before in all their encounters. Not anger, closer to assessment, the look of a man revising a calculation. Better at this than I expected, he said. She looked at him. Didn't expect much. No, he admitted. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. I saw a woman with a grievance. I thought you'd make noise, and then it would cost more than you had, and you'd stop. He looked at the street. I misjudged. You misjudged a lot of people, she said. Margaret Coe. The Hellers. My father. Your father was a different situation. My father was a man who worked that land for 30 years, and you took it because he was grieving, and the timing was convenient. She kept her voice level. She was not going to shout at him on a public sidewalk. That was not who she was. You've told yourself a story about what you do that makes it sound like business. It isn't. It's a choice. You chose it every single time. Crowley was quiet. He looked at her with that expression, the revised calculation, and she had the sense that very few people in his life had said things to him directly and looked him in the eye while they said them. Territory investigation will take months, he said. Even if Pruitt's statement holds, it will hold. And if it holds, he continued, the process is slow. You know that. I know that, she said. The fee has stayed. Reclassification is under formal question. The Donahue family and Creed are part of the record now. And so are the Hellers, and so is Margaret Coe. She looked at him steadily. Built something that required silence to function. Isn't silence anymore. He looked at her for a long moment. She could not tell what he was thinking, and she had stopped needing to. Proceeding was inside. The record was made. Whatever Crowley thought or felt or calculated on a cold sidewalk in Millhaven was no longer the most important variable in the situation. What do you want? He asked. From all of this, what do you actually want? She thought about it. She gave him the true answer. I want the water rights restored to where the 1,879 survey put them. I want the fees the affected ranchers have paid over 3 years refunded. I want the Voss property, my father's land, properly valued, and the difference between what it sold for at auction and what it was actually worth returned. She paused. I know the land itself is gone. I'm not asking for the land. He absorbed this. Something in his expression shifted, not softened, but became more specific, more present. That's a significant sum, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He looked at the street for a moment. Then he went back inside. She stood there for another minute, alone in the cold. She was not confident. Nah. She had told Wyatt the truth about that she was not able to be confident about how this resolved, and anyone who told her they were certain was either lying or hadn't thought carefully enough about how many moving pieces were involved. She had said what needed to be said, and it was in the record, and that was what she had come to Millhaven to do. She went back inside. The panel issued its preliminary findings 2 weeks later, and they were not everything, and they were more than nothing, which was roughly what Fitch had predicted. The panel found sufficient grounds to refer the reclassification matter to the territorial investigation, which was already underway. Found the Redstone Land and Water Company's collection of fees to be formally suspended pending that investigation. Issued a formal censure of the county surveyor's office for inadequate oversight of the reclassification process, a bureaucratic finding that would matter more in the months ahead than it appeared to in the moment. And it found, on the specific question of the complaint against Eliza Voss, that the complaint had been without merit and directed that it be expunged from all official records. Fitch read her the findings over coffee at the kitchen table at Blackridge, 3 days after they arrived. Read them in the flat, precise way of a man who had learned not to perform good news, because good news could still be complicated. She listened. She nodded at each finding. When he was done, she said the Voss property. The territorial investigation, he said. That's where the fraud case will be built. Months away still, possibly longer. But the reclassification finding is the spine of it. Once the reclassification is formally voided, the contracts that Crowley built on top of it become vulnerable. And the Voss foreclosure involved a fee dispute connected to water access on the south boundary that he stopped. It's complicated, but it's a thread that's now attached to something larger. Is there a realistic outcome where the difference in value is recovered? She asked. A realistic outcome, he said carefully, where a territorial court orders restitution across multiple affected properties. Whether that order is fully satisfied depends on Crowley's willingness to settle versus fight, and on the territorial court's appetite for enforcement. He paused. Crowley may settle. The alternative for him is a prolonged public proceeding that continues to document the scope of what he's done. Men like Crowley generally prefer a contained, expensive settlement to an open-ended, more expensive exposure. She thought about the sidewalk in Millhaven and what he had said to her. You're better at this than I expected. And then, what do you want? He'll settle, she said. Fitch looked at her. What makes you say that? Me what I wanted, she said. Men who are going to fight don't ask that. Fight. Fitch considered this. Then he said, you might be right. It was right that she might be right. Crowley's lawyers contacted Fitch's office 6 weeks into the territorial investigation with a proposal for structured restitution and negotiated settlement across all affected properties in exchange for the affected parties' agreement not to pursue further civil action. Negotiation took 3 months. It was not simple, and it was not pleasant, and there were 2 points at which Fitch told her it might fall apart, and both times it didn't. In the end, the settlement included the full restitution of fees paid to the Redstone Company by all affected ranchers over the period of the fraudulent reclassification. It included a payment to the estate of Thomas Voss, the estate being Eliza, there being no one else representing the difference between the auction price and the independently assessed value of the Voss property at the time of the foreclosure. It was not the land. She had said she wasn't asking for the land, and she had meant it. But it was something. It was, in the language of legal documents, a sum sufficient to, and she had not let Fitch finish reading that part. She had just set the document down and walked outside and stood in the yard at Blackridge for about 10 minutes, looking at nothing. When she came back in, Wyatt was in the kitchen. He had been waiting for her, which she could tell because he was standing, not sitting. There was nothing in his hands, no task. No document, just a man who had been waiting. Settlement, she said. Fitch told me the outline, he said. She nodded. Are you all right? She thought about it honestly. I don't know what I am, she said. I thought I'd feel I don't know. More certain about what comes next. That's because what comes next is actually open, he said. That's different from what you've been dealing with. She looked at him. For months, he said, everything has been defined by what Crowley was doing and what needed to happen in response. Almost easier, in a way. You know what you're fighting. You know which direction to face. He paused. When it's over, you have to decide for yourself what direction you want to face. She sat down at the kitchen table. He sat across from her. Not at the far end, across from her, the way they'd been sitting for months now when they talked in the kitchen. Comfortable proximity of two people who had stopped being careful about distance without marking the moment it changed. I have the money now, she said. Not a fortune, but enough to there are options. She said the word carefully. I could buy land. There are smaller properties. A start. Yes, he said, or I could stay. He was very still. Not as the cook, she said. Or not only. She looked at her hands on the table. This ranch is different than it was. You know that. Runs better. The accounts are healthy. The crew is solid. She paused. Some of that was always here. Some of it was built. By you, he said. By all of us, she said. But yes, some of it by me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to say something and I want to say it right, so bear with me. D, she waited. When you walked through that gate, he said, I was not here. In any way that mattered. I was going through the motions. I had been going through them for 3 years, and I had mostly stopped noticing that the motions were all there was. He stopped. Adjusted. You didn't fix me. I want to be clear about that, because I don't think you need the weight of that, and I don't think it's accurate. But you made it harder to stay gone. You were so relentlessly here. Every day, every problem, every conversation in this kitchen, late at night. You were here in a way that made me feel like being here was the thing to do. She listened to this carefully. She was aware of how much it had cost him to say it in those particular words. I'm not asking you to stay for the ranch, he said. Ranch will manage. I've figured out how to run it again, mostly, which is a thing I should have figured out earlier and didn't. He looked at her directly. I'm asking you to stay because I don't want you to leave. B. And I understand that's not a simple thing to say or to hear. And I understand you have options now, and you didn't before, and I don't want to be the thing you stay for because you have nowhere else to go. That's not, he stopped. That's not what I want. What do you want? She said, because someone had asked her that recently, and it had turned out to be a significant question. I want you here because you want to be here, he said, because this is the place you choose, not the place you ended up. She sat with this for a moment. She thought about the gate with the broken latch and the road north that she had walked because she happened to be facing that direction when she left the auction. She thought about her father's journal and the list of things to repair and the line that said she was better at this than she knew. She thought about what it meant to choose a place versus simply arriving in it. I want to fix the gate latch, she said. He blinked. What gate? At the entrance. With the broken latch. Been broken since I arrived. It's one of the first things I noticed. She looked at him. I've been meaning to get to it, and I never have, because there was always something more urgent. I want to fix it. She paused. That's not an answer to your question. I know that. I'm getting there. He waited. I came here without a plan, she said. I knocked on that door because May Pruitt told me you needed a cook and I needed to be somewhere. Everything that happened after was I didn't plan any of it. I didn't plan to find the ledger or to see what I saw or to do what I did. She paused. But I don't regret it. Any of it. Not even the hard parts. She looked at him. The place I was going toward when I was walking north on that road, even though I didn't know it. I don't fully understand that, but I believe it. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the studying, measuring look of those first weeks, not the careful, controlled look of a man managing his own grief, but something more open than either, more present. Then stay, he said, simply. Then I'll stay, she said. Kitchen was quiet. Outside, the afternoon was going long and gold across the yard, the same as it had on a dozen afternoons before this one. Gate latch, he said after a moment. This week, she said. I'll help, he said. She almost smiled. I know how to fix a gate latch. I know you do, he said. I want to help anyway. Territorial investigation concluded 7 months after the filing, and its findings were formal and documented and damaging to Victor Crowley in the specific and lasting way of things that go into official records and stay there. Redstone Land and Water Company was dissolved by territorial order. South Fork water access reverted to the boundary established by the original 1879 survey, which meant it sat on Blackridge's eastern property line, exactly where Thomas Voss's fence posts had always said it should. Crowley paid the settlement. He did not do it gracefully, and he did not do it quickly, and Fitch earned his fee several times over in the subsequent negotiations. But he did it, because the alternative, a prolonged territorial proceeding with Harlan Pruitt as a cooperative witness and Margaret Coe's documents in the record, would have cost him more in every way that mattered to a man like him. He did not leave the county. Eliza had wondered if he would. And he didn't, which told her something about him, that the county was what he had built his identity on. And leaving it would have cost him something he wasn't willing to lose. Even diminished. She saw him twice in subsequent months. In Millhaven, at a distance, and he did not acknowledge her, and she did not acknowledge him. That was the shape their relationship took going forward. It was not the ending of a story where the villain disappears. It was still there, diminished but present, a man who had been stopped but not transformed. She had no illusions about that. He was stopped, and the water ran where it was supposed to run. Margaret Coe received a payment that let her sell the boarding house and move to her sister's place in Nebraska if she wanted to, which she ultimately did. Harris's hands didn't get better. They weren't going to. But he stayed at Blackridge, and Wyatt adjusted his work accordingly without making a ceremony of it, which was the kind of consideration that doesn't announce itself but means everything. Pete Ortega's arm healed clean, the way she had said it would. He stayed on. He became, over time, the kind of hand that other new hands watched to understand how things were done. Caleb was offered a foreman position at a neighboring outfit the following spring. And he took it. And Eliza cooked a particular dinner the night before he left that she did not call a farewell dinner, but that was clearly a farewell dinner. He ate it with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who understands he is being sent off with genuine warmth and doesn't quite know what to do with that. Gideon Shaw stayed. He was not an easier man to work with after everything that had happened. He was still territorial and proud and occasional in his warmth. The quality of the working relationship between him and Eliza had settled into something functional and, in its way, solid. They argued sometimes. They came to agreements. He stopped walking into the kitchen like he'd already decided something and started walking in like a man who was willing to think about it first. That was enough. The gate latch got fixed on a Tuesday in late spring. It was not a dramatic occasion. Wyatt found the right piece of hardware at Doyle's, and Eliza was the one who fitted it and secured it. Wyatt held the gate steady while she worked, which was a practical division of labor and nothing more. Except that it was also more than that, because everything at this point was also more than what had appeared on the surface, and she had stopped pretending otherwise. When the latch was seated and the gate swung true, she tested it twice open, closed. Click of it, clean and right, and she stood back and looked at it. Better, Wyatt said. Much better, she said. She thought about her father's journal, about what she had read on the flat rock by the side of the road, in the heat of the morning after everything was gone. A broken thing is not the same as a ruined thing. She had not understood, sitting on that rock, what the words were for. She understood now. She had not gotten her father's land back. She had gotten something else, something she had not known to want, because she had not known it was possible. Not the life she had expected to rebuild, but a life she had not imagined and could not have planned and would not trade. That was the thing nobody told you about loss, not the loss itself, but what came after. People talked about recovery, like it was a return to where you were, like the goal was to get back to the last place you recognized. Couldn't go back. The land was sold, and the grave was permanent, and the photograph that had been laid face down was not unhurt by the laying. Could not go back. You could only go forward into something you had not been before. She had been a daughter and a ranch hand and a cook. She was something more complicated now, harder to describe, easier to see. A woman who had walked north on a road, going nowhere in particular, and arrived somewhere that turned out to matter. A woman who had fixed things because they needed fixing, and because she was capable of fixing them, and because she had learned from her father that a broken thing is not a ruined thing. A woman who had found people worth standing beside, and been found by them in return. Gate swung clean on its new latch. The South Fork Creek ran where the 1,879 survey said it should run. Kitchen at Blackridge smelled of coffee and something baking and the particular warmth of a house where people were fed and expected. It was not perfect. It would never be perfect. The scars on Wyatt's face, the ones you couldn't see but knew were there, those didn't disappear because a territorial court issued its findings. Her own grief for her father was not resolved by a legal settlement. It would resurface, unexpectedly, on ordinary mornings, the way grief always did, and she would feel it and keep working, because that was the only honest way through. She was here. She had chosen here. On the frontier, in that unforgiving stretch of country where the land asked everything of you and gave back only what you earned, that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything.